Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The ghost train in Detroit. It was late, later than I had intended to be in that part of the city. The old railway depot in Detroit had been abandoned for years, a relic of the past, covered in rust and shadows. The air was thick with a dampness that seemed to cling to everything, as though even the bricks themselves were haunted. I was here because of a story. A story that had been whispered to me by a colleague who worked at the depot decades ago, and which had always stuck with me, the ghost train. I hadn't believed it, not at first. People love telling ghost stories, especially about abandoned places like this. But something about the way my colleague spoke, the way his voice dropped when he mentioned the train, kept me up at night. He had never really explained it, only said it was something that couldn't be explained. The train that never left. I stood there now, staring at the rotting wooden platform, the tracks stretched out before me, rusted and overgrown with weeds. The windows of the old depot were dark, but I swore I saw movement, shadows flickering behind the grime. The kind of movement that you notice just out of the corner of your eye, but when you turn to look, it's gone. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I shouldn't have come. It was late, and the place was eerie, almost waiting. But curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me toward the platform. The old building groaned in the wind as I stepped onto the tracks, the sound echoing in the silence. The air felt heavier here, as if the darkness itself had weight. I paused, scanning the area, but all I could see was the moonlight struggling to break through the thick clouds. The faintest sound reached my ears, something subtle, almost imperceptible. A low hum, like the soft whine of an engine in the distance. I looked toward the far end of the tracks, but there was nothing. Just the long, winding rail that stretched into the blackness beyond the station. The sound of the hum grew louder, clearer. My heart skipped a beat. It sounded like a train. Impossible. No one had used these tracks in years. I turned, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of my imagination, but there it was again, the unmistakable sound of an engine grinding along metal. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The hum was growing louder, closer now, as though something was indeed moving down the track. I could feel the vibrations under my feet as if the rails themselves were alive. But still, I saw nothing. I felt a strange pull toward the far end of the platform. Something, or maybe someone, was waiting there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to call out, to shake off the unease, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I moved forward, driven by a force I couldn't explain. As I neared the edge of the platform, the sound of the train grew deafening, and yet I saw no lights, no sign of motion. And then, just as I reached the edge, it happened. The train appeared. It was as if the darkness itself had parted to reveal it. A huge, black locomotive, gleaming in the moonlight. It was old, much older than any train I had ever seen, with intricate details carved into its frame. But the most unsettling thing was the passengers, ghostly figures, standing still inside the windows. They were silent, waiting. Their faces were blurred, indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. I took a step back, a chill crawling up my spine. The train had stopped in front of me, but there was no sound, no screeching of brakes, no hiss of steam. Just an unnatural stillness, like the world itself had paused. A voice whispered in my ear, low, insistent. "Don't get on. Don't go near the train." My heart raced as I turned around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one. The platform was empty. I looked back at the train. It stood there, ominously silent. The figures inside hadn't moved. I felt an impulse, a strange compulsion to climb aboard, but I resisted. Something wasn't right. It couldn't be right. As I stood frozen, staring at the train, a flash of movement caught my eye. One of the figures in the window moved, slowly, turning its head toward me. The face that appeared was pale, hollow-eyed, its expression vacant. The figure mouthed something, but no sound came out. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The train was now completely still, as though time itself had stopped. Then the door of the train slid open, slowly, almost invitingly. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The train was waiting for me. It wanted me. The shadows around me seemed to deepen, and I could feel the air growing colder. I looked down at the tracks beneath my feet, the eerie hum still echoing in my mind. Something was coming, and it wasn't just the train. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed by a fear that gripped me tighter than any chain. The train's door remained open, but I felt no sense of invitation, no warmth, only an overwhelming pull toward the unknown. The figures inside the train were still, their faces locked in a permanent expression of waiting. Waiting for something, or someone. The hum, that low, persistent vibration, intensified, resonating in my bones. The air grew colder still, heavier, and I noticed how the night around me seemed to grow darker. The shadows stretched longer, as if reaching out to touch me, to draw me closer to the train. My thoughts scrambled for rational explanations. This couldn't be real. There had to be a logical explanation, some malfunction, some trick of the light. But even as I tried to convince myself, deep down, I knew that the answer was something much more sinister. I took a cautious step back. Then another. But the moment my foot left the track, a sound pierced the silence, sharp, electric. A crackling, like static before a storm. The train's door slammed shut, as if in response to my hesitation. My heart skipped a beat. Then, the train moved. Slowly at first, as though testing the weight of the world, and then faster, gathering speed. The wheels screeched against the rails, sending tremors through the ground beneath me. It was moving, but there was no engine sound. No whistle. Just the sound of the wheels, grinding against the tracks, relentless, inevitable. I stood frozen, watching as the ghostly train began to pass. The figures inside didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel them watching, waiting for something. My breath came in shallow gasps as the train rolled past, and that's when I saw it, a glimpse of one of the passengers' faces, clear now, in the faint light. A woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, her skin drawn tight across her skull, and her eyes, those eyes, were hollow, black voids. She stared at me, unblinking, and in her gaze, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a silent plea. She was trapped. The realization hit me like a wave. The passengers weren't waiting to get off. They were waiting for the train to come back, waiting for someone to join them in their endless ride. This wasn't just any train. It was a prison. A purgatory. And the passengers? They were the lost souls, forever bound to the rails. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my chest. The train was still moving, the figures still staring at me. And then I saw something else, something even more chilling. As the train passed, the tracks behind it began to shimmer. A distortion in the air, like heat rising off asphalt, but darker. And then, there it was, a shape. A figure, standing on the tracks, waiting for the train to pass. I blinked, but it didn't disappear. The figure was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, something from another time. A man. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his presence. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my existence. He just stood there, waiting. The train passed him without hesitation, and as it did, I noticed something else. The man's eyes, glowing, faintly. A deep, unnatural glow, like the light of a distant star. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. But his gaze was fixed on the train, fixed on the passengers. It hit me then. He wasn't waiting for the train to stop. He was waiting for it to move. He wasn't lost. He was part of this. He was one of them. Suddenly, the hum, the vibrations, the weight of the air around me, all became too much. I had to leave. I had to get away from this place, from the train, from the watching eyes. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the gravel as I sprinted down the tracks, my breath ragged and sharp in my chest. The sound of the train behind me was louder now, growing closer, but I didn't dare look back. I pushed harder, the adrenaline surging through me as I ran faster, faster, until a cold gust of wind whipped past me, almost knocking me off my feet. My heart raced in panic, my mind screaming at me to keep going, to escape. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't running fast enough. That something was gaining on me, something that wouldn't stop until it caught me. I glanced back, just for a moment. The train was there, right behind me, moving at a speed it shouldn't have been able to reach. The doors were open again. The figures inside, silent, motionless, were waiting. And the man, the one who had been standing on the tracks, was now there, standing just outside the door, his eyes glowing, fixed on me. I heard a voice, soft at first, then growing louder, calling my name. It was not the man. It was not the train. It was something else, something deeper, something that made my blood run cold. Come with us. I stumbled to a halt, my feet dragging in the gravel. The voice wasn't coming from the train. It wasn't coming from the man. It was coming from inside my own mind. Before I could turn around again, the sound of the train's brakes screeched. It was too late. The darkness closed in, the shadows swallowing the light, and I was left standing alone in the emptiness, with only the cold, endless hum of the tracks to keep me company. The train had stopped, and I had just boarded. The moment I stepped onto the train, I felt it, a coldness that seeped into my bones, deeper than any winter chill. The door closed behind me with a final, echoing thud, sealing me inside the train. My heart hammered against my chest, but there was no turning back. The train had already begun moving, the wheels turning against the tracks in a slow, ominous rhythm. Inside, it was dark. The only light came from the faint glow of the windows, barely enough to make out the figures around me. They stood in silence, just as they had on the outside. The passengers, ghostly, pale, their eyes dark and unblinking, were frozen in place, like mannequins trapped in a nightmarish diorama. I tried to focus on them, to understand what was happening, but the sight of their vacant expressions only filled me with more dread. I took a shaky breath, my hands gripping the cold metal rail beside me as the train continued its journey. My mind raced with questions. Why was I here? What had I done to deserve this? And who were these people, these souls that seemed to be stuck in this endless ride? They didn't look at me. They didn't move. They just waited. I tried to speak, to ask one of them what was happening, but my voice came out as a faint whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the train. There was no response. I began to walk through the car, moving cautiously, my feet making soft, hollow sounds on the floor. The train creaked and groaned, as if it, too, was old and tired. The passage of time felt strange here, slowed, almost suspended. The windows didn't show any signs of movement, but I could feel the train speeding forward, an unstoppable force. As I passed through the cars, I noticed something odd. The figures seemed to shift, subtly, though I couldn't say how. There was something about their presence that felt different, as if they were no longer just waiting, but aware of me. Their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, began to follow my movements, tracking me with a quiet intensity. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding faster now. I could hear my breath growing more erratic as I reached the next car. There, I saw it, another figure, standing by the door. A man, dressed in a tattered suit, his face hidden in shadow. His eyes, too, glowed faintly in the dim light, but unlike the others, he was watching me. Watching me with a strange, knowing look. I stopped in my tracks, my throat tightening. Something about him felt different. He wasn't like the others. He was aware. And as he stepped closer, the train seemed to shift beneath my feet, as if it were reacting to his movement. Why am I here? I whispered, barely able to force the words out. The man didn't answer immediately. He just kept walking toward me, his gaze never leaving mine. As he reached me, he stopped, standing mere inches away. His breath was cold, like a gust of wind off a frozen lake. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the weight of his presence pressing against me. "You shouldn't have come," he finally said, his voice low and raspy, like something scraped over stone. I didn't know how to respond. My mouth felt dry, and my legs were shaking beneath me. "I didn't mean to." "You never do," he interrupted, his eyes glowing brighter now, a sickly greenish hue that seemed to pierce through the dimness of the train. "No one ever means to come here. But once you do, there's no way back. The train keeps moving, and so do we." I took a step back, trying to move away from him, but he grabbed my arm, his grip icy and unyielding. "Let go!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest, but his fingers only tightened, sending a jolt of cold through my body. His gaze didn't falter, didn't blink, as if he was feeding off my fear. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice carrying a strange power. "We're all here for the same reason. Some of us know it. Some of us never do. But the ride doesn't end until it does." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the weight of them pressing down on me, suffocating me, like the very air in the train had become thick and heavy. I could feel the walls closing in, the figures around me shifting, closing in, their eyes following my every move. The train's movement was no longer smooth. It was jerky, uneven, as if the tracks themselves were warping and bending under the weight of the unseen force that surrounded us. "Please," I gasped, my voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't respond. He only stared at me with that vacant, glowing gaze. And then, as if my words had no meaning, he released my arm. I stumbled back, barely able to catch my breath as I looked around. The train had become something else, something darker, more oppressive. The windows, which had once shown nothing but darkness, now reflected the inside of the train. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was a distortion. A twisted version of reality. I could see the faces of the passengers more clearly now, no longer silent, but murmuring, their lips moving in an endless chant. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on me. And that's when I realized I was the next passenger. The man's words echoed in my mind, and the truth struck me like a blade through my chest. I had boarded the train, and now I would never leave. The train began to slow, and as it did, the shadows in the windows grew deeper. The passengers stirred. Some reached out, their ghostly hands stretching toward me, beckoning me into their fold. There was no escape. The doors opened again. But this time, there was no hesitation. This time, the darkness was welcoming. And the train, with all its lost souls, had found its newest passenger. The doors closed, and the train moved on. And I, too, would never stop. I woke up, but not in the way one usually wakes from a dream. There was no sudden clarity, no relief from the oppressive weight of sleep. I opened my eyes, but the world around me was no longer the world I knew. The train moved steadily, the soft rhythmic hum of the wheels over the tracks like a lullaby that drowned out all thought. The air was still cold, but this time it didn't make me shiver. It was familiar. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like it was weighed down by something invisible. The figures around me, those passengers, those lost souls, no longer seemed as distant as they had before. They were closer now, as if they were aware of me, just as I was aware of them. Their hollow eyes turned toward me in unison, not with the vacant stare of the first moment, but with something else, a recognition. One by one, they began to shift, the slow, deliberate motion of their limbs like the creaking of an old door. It was as though they had been waiting for me to wake up, waiting for me to finally realize what I had become. I opened my mouth to speak, to cry out, but my voice was gone. There was no sound. The silence here was absolute, suffocating, as if the train itself had swallowed the very air. I was no longer afraid, though. I should have been. Everything in me screamed that I should run, should struggle, should try to escape, but it was as if something inside me had already surrendered. I had accepted the truth without even knowing when. I turned to face the window, but the reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own. The figure in the glass was a mirror image, yes, but something had changed. My face, pale, hollow-eyed, expressionless, looked back at me with the same vacant gaze I had seen in the others. I was one of them now. A gentle whisper brushed across my mind, though I couldn't tell if it came from within or from the others around me. It wasn't words, exactly, but something deeper, a sense of understanding. We were passengers in the traditional sense. We weren't traveling from one place to another. We were caught in a journey that had no destination. We were waiting for something that would never come. The train passed through endless darkness, the tracks winding on and on into the abyss. The scenery outside had long since faded into blackness, and the only light was the dim glow from the train's windows, faint like the last remnants of a dying star. There were no signs of life, no landmarks, no end to the tunnel. Just the eternal hum of the train's movement. And yet, somehow, I knew that we weren't alone. The other passengers, those silent figures who had once seemed so distant, were now all around me. They moved in tandem, their heads turning slowly to follow my every movement. They reached out with their hands, not in desperation, but in a slow, synchronized motion, as if they were inviting me to join them in the endless wait. A part of me, the last part that still clung to something familiar, something real, tried to pull away, to push past them. But my body refused to obey. My limbs felt stiff, as if they had forgotten what it meant to move freely. Every step I took felt unnatural, like I was being pulled by an invisible force. I turned to face the man again, the one who had first spoken to me. His eyes were now filled with a soft, ethereal glow, the same hue as the others, but with a depth to them that felt almost knowing. He didn't speak, but his gaze held me captive, and I couldn't tear myself away. "You can't leave," he said, though his lips never moved. The words rang clearly in my mind, as if he were speaking directly to my soul. "Not anymore. You're one of us now." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped me. The fear I had felt earlier, the terror that had driven me to try and escape, had dissolved into something else. A quiet acceptance. The fear was gone, replaced by a numbness that settled deep inside my chest. I wasn't human anymore. I wasn't even alive, not in the way I had once understood it. I was something else, something caught between time and space, between life and death. I looked around, and the faces of the other passengers seemed to mirror my own realization. They weren't lost anymore. They were home. The train creaked again, the sound of its wheels grinding over the rails like a low, mournful sigh. It was as if it, too, had grown tired of this endless journey. I looked out the window again, but there was nothing to see, no stars, no sky, no light. Just darkness, endless and consuming. And then, I felt it. The pull. It wasn't physical. It wasn't a force that tugged at me from outside, but something from within. It was as if the train itself had become part of me, and I had become part of it. We were one. We were the same. And I knew then that I would never leave. Not the train. Not the passengers. Not this place. I turned back to the others, their faces now familiar in their strangeness. We were all the same. All waiting. Waiting for something that would never come. The train moved on, its journey endless. And I, now one of them, could only wait with it. Forever. Time had lost all meaning. Days? Months? Years? They passed without any sense of progression. The train continued to move, though there were no longer any markers of where it was headed. It wasn't a journey in any real sense. It was a loop, a never-ending cycle. The same faces, the same cold, oppressive silence. But now, it was different. I had changed. I wasn't merely a passenger anymore. I was a part of the train, a part of this endless motion. It was as if I had become the very essence of the journey. The other passengers, those lost souls who had once been so distant, now felt like family. We moved together in perfect synchronization, an unspoken unity that stretched across the entire train. And yet, deep inside me, something stirred, a fleeting memory, a whisper of something long gone. I remembered what it felt like to be alive, to breathe freely, to move without the heavy weight of eternity pressing down on every step. But the memory was fading, slipping through my fingers like smoke. I couldn't grasp it anymore. I couldn't hold on. I looked out the window again. The darkness still stretched on endlessly, like an abyss with no end, no beginning. But this time, something was different. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely visible against the inky blackness. It was so small, so distant, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. But then it grew brighter, clearer. A signal. A sign. I stood up, my limbs moving with a strange, almost mechanical precision. The other passengers didn't notice, or perhaps they didn't care. They remained still, their eyes empty, as though they had given up all hope of ever seeing anything beyond the confines of the train. But I wasn't like them. Not anymore. I had to know what that light was. I made my way toward the door, my feet dragging against the cold metal floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the door, I saw the man again, the one who had spoken to me, the one who had told me there was no escape. He was standing by the door, watching me with those glowing eyes. His face was blank, expressionless, but his gaze told me everything I needed to know. "You can't leave," he said again, his voice echoing in my mind. But this time, his words didn't have the same power they once did. Something inside me had changed. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had nothing left to fear. I had no place in his train, no reason to stay. And whatever that light was, whatever it promised, I had to find it. I stepped toward the door. The man didn't stop me. He didn't move. He just watched. The door opened with a quiet hiss, and I stepped into the cold, unknown darkness. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything shifted. The train, the passengers, the endless hum of the wheels, they all faded away, swallowed by the void. The light ahead grew brighter, warmer, pulling me toward it with a force I couldn't resist. And then, as I approached the light, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a figure, standing alone in the dark. A man. A figure not unlike the one who had spoken to me, but his eyes weren't glowing. They were clear, human, alive. "You're here," he said softly, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. I stopped before him, my heart beating faster, my breath sharp in my chest. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was, what was happening, but no words came. His presence was overwhelming, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. A sense of peace, as though I had finally found something I had been searching for. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice warm, though tinged with sadness. "You haven't forgotten what you were. You're still holding on to something important." The words hit me like a flood. I remembered. I remembered everything. I remembered the world outside. I remembered sunlight, laughter, the feel of grass beneath my feet. I remembered the sound of my name being called, the warmth of a hand in mine. I remembered what it meant to live. And I knew that I couldn't stay here, in this endless place of waiting. "You have a choice," the man said, his voice growing quieter now. "You can stay, forever, lost in the train, with the others. Or you can go, but you won't return the same." The choice lay before me. The door to the train still stood open behind me, the cold, empty interior beckoning with the hollow promise of eternal waiting. The light, the warmth, the chance to remember, to return to life, these were the things that called me forward. I hesitated, just for a moment. A fleeting doubt tried to creep in. What if this was another trap? What if leaving was the wrong choice? But then, I realized. There was nothing left for me in the train. I had become one of them, the lost, the forgotten, the ones who could never move on. But I could still choose. I took a step forward. The light enveloped me. And then everything stopped. There was no train. No dark, endless void. No passengers. just the quiet hum of life, of breathing, of moving, of being. And as I stood there, I understood. The train had been nothing but a moment, a passage. The souls on board weren't just trapped, they were waiting for someone to remember them. To remember that they were once human, once alive. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I turned and walked away from the light. Not to return to the train, but to return to the world I had once known. The last stop had arrived. And I was free. Carolina Black Widow. It was a cold night, the kind that made the trees sway like dark, twisted figures under the moonlight. I was driving back from town, the road stretching out before me, empty and silent, as it always did in these parts of South Carolina. It wasn't unusual for the streets to be quiet. Out here, everything was spread far apart. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but still managed to keep their distance. I wasn't new to this area. I'd been living here for years, but something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the way the air hung still, like it was waiting for something to happen. Or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to press closer to the road, their limbs scratching the sky. I couldn't say for sure. But there was something in the air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up just a little. As I turned onto the old dirt road leading home, the headlights of my truck cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar crossroads just ahead. The one by the old church, where the trees formed a thick canopy and the ground was worn from years of tires rolling over it. There was nothing particularly special about that intersection, yet tonight, I felt a strange pull toward it. I slowed down as I approached, something tugging at my gut, but I couldn't figure out why. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, something that belonged to the trees or the flicker of my headlights. But as I drew closer, the figure became clearer, an almost perfect silhouette of a woman standing still at the center of the intersection. She was wearing a black dress, flowing in dark as the night around her, and her face was obscured by a veil. It wasn't her appearance that made me freeze, but the feeling she gave off. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at her. The closer I got, the harder it became to breathe. My chest tightened, and my grip on the steering wheel grew stronger without me realizing it. I tried to look away, thinking that maybe I was just tired, imagining things. But I couldn't. It was like she had pulled me in, as if her presence was seeping into the very air I breathed. I was only a few yards from the intersection when I saw her move. Not like a normal person walking, but more like she floated. One moment, she was standing at the center of the crossroads, and the next, she was gone, vanished into thin air, like smoke fading into the night. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell? My mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. There was no way I could have passed her, not without seeing her again. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty intersection, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing, something inside me couldn't shake the fear. My hands were clammy on the wheel, my breath shallow. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The ones about the woman in black who appeared at crossroads. They called her the Black Widow, though no one knew exactly why. There were rumors, whispers about how she made people disappear, or how her presence left a lasting terror in their souls. Most folks treated it like some old ghost story, something to tell around a campfire and forget about in the morning. But as I sat there, my heart thumping in my chest, I realized something. This wasn't just a story. Something was out there in the dark. And it was real. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but it didn't work. Every inch of me screamed to get away, to drive as fast as I could and never look back. But I couldn't. The road was empty, save for me and the darkness around me, and I felt like I had to stay, to figure out what was happening. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I had been driving too long. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened at the crossroads wasn't over. It was still there, lingering in the air, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I forced myself to drive forward, past the intersection, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I half expected to see her there, standing in the road, watching me, but there was nothing. Just the darkness, as it should be. Still, I couldn't shake the fear in my chest. It wasn't just the sight of the woman, it was the feeling she left behind. The dread, the weight of her presence, that seemed to cling to the very air. And for the rest of the night, no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape it. It followed me. The unease. The panic. That fear, the kind that settles deep in your bones, stays with you long after the thing you're afraid of is gone. And I knew then, I had just begun to understand the terror of the woman in black. The days after that night were a blur. I told myself it was just a freak occurrence, an illusion caused by the fatigue of a long drive. But deep down, I knew something had changed. It wasn't just the woman in black, though she was at the center of it all. It was the feeling that followed me, the persistent unease that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. The nights became the worst. I couldn't sleep, couldn't rest without feeling that cold, prickling sensation creeping up the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. The dark corners of my house seemed darker than before. The silence between each creak of the floorboards felt too loud. I tried to explain it away, but the fear still clung to me, tighter than any blanket could comfort. I avoided that crossroads, of course. Who wouldn't? But it didn't matter how much I tried to stay away from the place where I had first seen her. The feeling of her presence haunted me wherever I went. It was like she had embedded herself into my life, an unseen shadow, always lurking at the edges of my vision. It started to affect my work. I'm a mechanic, not the type to be easily rattled by things I can't explain. I deal with machines, nuts and bolts, things that are supposed to make sense. But lately, I couldn't concentrate. My hands shook when I picked up a wrench. My eyes couldn't focus on the task at hand, always drifting toward the window or the door. And that dread, how could I describe it? It wasn't fear of something specific. It was just a weight, a pressure in the air that made everything feel wrong. It was one evening, a few days after the incident, when the panic finally broke through. I was heading home from the shop, driving a familiar route, when I saw her again. At first, I thought I was seeing things, just a trick of the light, some illusion in the fading twilight. But no! There she was, standing at the same intersection, her black dress flowing in the breeze, her figure impossibly still, like she was waiting. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared at her, unable to look away, though every instinct screamed at me to drive in the opposite direction. Her face was still hidden by that veil, but I could feel her eyes, even though I couldn't see them. It was as if they were locked on mine, piercing straight through me, weighing me down. The same cold dread filled my chest. The same tightening in my throat, like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to look away, to drive off and pretend I hadn't seen her. But I couldn't. The woman didn't move. She didn't need to. It was like she knew I wouldn't leave. It was like she was waiting for me to understand something. The silence stretched, unbearable, pressing on me from all sides. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the panic wouldn't let go. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow, as I sat frozen. I knew I had to drive away, but I couldn't make myself do it. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at her. It felt like minutes, hours, even though it was only a few seconds. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. One moment, she was there, as solid as the night itself, and the next, she vanished. No movement. No sound. Like she had never been there at all. My heart pounded in my ears as I jerked the truck into gear and sped off, my foot pressed to the gas, the engine roaring in protest. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't bear to see her there again, standing silently behind me. When I finally reached home, I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel anything at all. It was like I was carrying the weight of that presence with me, that terrible sensation of being watched, even though no one was there. The darkness that had surrounded me on the road seemed to follow me into my house, seeping through the walls, curling around the corners of every room. I tried to turn on the lights. I tried to get some rest. But no matter what I did, the feeling wouldn't leave. The next day, I spoke to a few of the locals, trying to make sense of what was happening. I wasn't the first person to see the woman, after all. Old man Daniels, who ran the gas station on the outskirts of town, had heard the stories. He'd seen her himself, years ago, he said. He even swore he had seen someone else go mad after meeting her, some young man who had lost his mind in the weeks that followed. She comes around when the night's heavy and the moon's hidden, he told me, his voice low, almost a whisper. Some say she's a widow, others say she was a witch. But nobody really knows for sure. What we all know is that when you see her, you feel it. That fear. That something's wrong feeling. It doesn't leave, not ever. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to believe that it was all just a myth, a tale spun by the heat of summer nights. But deep down, I knew he was right. I couldn't escape it. She was out there, waiting. And I was afraid of what she wanted, and afraid of what would happen if I kept seeing her. But I had to know. I had to understand. I couldn't keep running. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and anxious thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of the woman in black from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing. At the intersection, motionless, her presence hanging in the air like a thick fog. The fear that she had instilled in me was unlike anything I had ever felt before, and no matter how hard I tried to move past it, I couldn't. I found myself driving the same route over and over, as if I could confront the thing that terrified me head on. The crossroads, where she had first appeared, had become a place I couldn't avoid, even though every instinct told me to stay far away. It was as though some part of me knew that I had to face whatever was out there, whatever she was, if I ever hoped to make sense of it. I knew I was slipping into something dangerous, but it didn't stop me. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, I found myself pulling up to the intersection again. The roads were empty, the trees lining the path swaying gently in the breeze. The air felt thick, suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. And then I saw her. She was standing in the same spot, in the same black dress, her figure indistinct against the darkening sky. Her veil fluttered lightly in the wind, but her face remained hidden. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her this time. I told myself I was ready to confront her, to understand whatever twisted force had taken root in this place. I stopped the truck just short of the intersection, leaving the engine running, and sat there for a moment, trying to gather my courage. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my palms slick with sweat. But still, I didn't move. I had to face her. I had to find out what she wanted. It was then that I heard it, the soft rustling, the unmistakable sound of fabric brushing against itself. The woman took a step forward. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she knew exactly how long she could keep me trapped by her presence. I should have driven away, but I didn't. Something inside me, the part that had been numb to the world for days now, wanted to go to her. I wanted to reach out, to touch her, to make her real. But I couldn't move. I could only watch. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, she moved again. She didn't walk like a normal person. No, this time she glided across the ground, her feet barely touching the earth. The veil she wore fluttered more violently now, and I could see something through the thin material. Her face, pale, gaunt, with dark eyes that seemed too deep, too endless to be human. I felt my stomach turn as those eyes met mine. A cold chill ran through me, deeper than any winter air, and for the first time, I understood the fear that came with her. It wasn't just her appearance, it was her presence, the oppressive weight of her being that made everything feel wrong. The trees seemed to bend closer to the road, their twisted limbs reaching out like fingers, the air thick with something that tasted like smoke. She was no longer a figure in the distance, no longer a myth. She was standing before me, impossibly close now, her figure melding with the shadows around her until she was just an extension of the darkness itself. And then I heard her voice. It was soft at first, barely audible above the wind. A whisper, like a breath on the back of my neck. You shouldn't have come. The words didn't make sense, not at first. But as they echoed in my mind, the fear tightened around my chest. It was as though the air itself had thickened, become suffocating, and the sound of her voice stirred something deep within me, something ancient, something that shouldn't have been there. I wanted to look away. I wanted to drive off and forget all of this. But my body wouldn't move, my mind was frozen by her presence. She spoke again, and this time the words were clearer, more direct. Now, you'll never leave. I swallowed hard, the words echoing through my head, reverberating like a warning. My body finally responded, heart racing as I tried to throw the truck into reverse. But nothing happened. The gear shift wouldn't budge. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in silence, with only the faint rustling of leaves for company. The woman was still standing there, her face still hidden beneath the veil, but her presence was heavier now, more oppressive. I felt the darkness around her pressing on me, closing in. There was no escape. I tried to open the door, to get out and run, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. It was as if some unseen force had locked me in place. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body trembling from the sheer force of her power. That was when I realized it wasn't just fear that she fed on. It was something deeper. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, to tilt, as though the entire world was turning against me. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my mind, to think clearly. But when I opened them again, she was gone. The crossroads were empty. The air felt still once more. The weight that had pressed down on me disappeared as if it had never been there at all. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty road ahead, too scared to move, too afraid to believe what had just happened. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what I had just experienced, and the worst part was, I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I wasn't sure if I had just been given a glimpse of something ancient, something that had been waiting for me all this time. But one thing was clear. The woman in black wasn't just a ghost. She was something more. And I was never going to be the same. I don't know how I managed to drive away that night. I don't know what kept my hands from shaking as I gripped the steering wheel and slowly made my way back home. The truck's engine roared as I sped down the empty road, trying to outrun the feeling that lingered in the air, that invisible weight that had attached itself to me like a second skin. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't outrun her. I couldn't outrun the fear. When I got back to my house, I didn't know what to do. The place felt too quiet, too still. The shadows in every room seemed darker, thicker, pressing against the walls like they were trying to swallow me whole. I locked all the doors and windows, checked them twice, then sat down at the kitchen table. My mind was racing, but the thoughts didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, that I had been too tired, too sleep-deprived, but something deep inside told me that wasn't it. I had seen her. She was real. The thing that terrified me the most wasn't the image of the woman in black, or the fear she had caused. No, it was what she had said. Now, you'll never leave. What did that mean? What had she done to me? I tried to push the thought away, to distract myself with anything, watching TV, cleaning the kitchen, anything to stop my mind from spiraling. But it didn't work. The thought of her, of what she could do, kept creeping back in. That night, I tried to sleep. I turned off the lights, curled up in bed, and pulled the blankets over my head, hoping that somehow it would protect me. But the silence in the house was suffocating. The air felt thick, as though something was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I could hear the faint sound of scratching, like fingernails running across the walls. It was soft, barely noticeable, but it was there. It made my skin crawl. I pulled the covers over my head tighter, trying to ignore it. But the sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my bedroom door. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't. There was something out there. Something watching me. I swung my legs out of bed and slowly made my way to the door, my breath catching in my throat. I gripped the doorknob, my hand trembling, and slowly turned it. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. But the feeling in the air, it was wrong. It was wrong in a way that I couldn't explain, but it made every muscle in my body tense up, every instinct scream at me to run. I stepped back into the room, shutting the door behind me and locking it tight. The air felt colder now, colder than it had been when I first came home. I pulled out my phone, tried to call someone, anyone, but the signal was gone. My phone was dead. The same feeling of isolation I had felt when I first saw her crept back, colder and more suffocating than before. And then, through the silence, I heard it. A knock. It came from somewhere in the house. A soft, almost polite knock, like someone was waiting for me to answer. I froze, not daring to move. The knock came again, louder this time. I swallowed hard, fear constricting my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the window, hoping I could see something, anything, that would reassure me. But the outside world was as dark as the room I stood in. No movement. No lights. Just the oppressive, infinite black of the night. The knock came again, more insistent now. It was coming from the back door. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just sit here and wait, but I couldn't bring myself to check either. The thought of opening the door, of letting whatever was on the other side in, was unbearable. But the knocking didn't stop. I couldn't keep hiding from it. It felt like I was being pulled into something that I didn't understand, something I couldn't escape. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room, the weight of it comforting in my hands, though I knew it wouldn't do a thing to whatever had been haunting me. I moved toward the back door, my feet feeling heavier with each step, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached for the doorknob, hand shaking as I twisted it. And there she was. The woman in black. She was standing on the other side of the door, her face hidden by the veil, her figure impossibly still. Her presence was as cold and suffocating as ever, but this time I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond, my body paralyzed by the terror that was crushing the air out of me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I could feel it now, her power, her influence. It was seeping through the door, through the walls, through my very bones. Her presence was everywhere, and I realized, too late, that I was trapped. I had walked into her web. The woman didn't need to speak for me to understand. Her silence was worse than any scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But no sound came out. In that moment, I knew I would never escape her. The darkness, the fear, the woman in black, she was part of me now. There was no way out. I was hers. And she had come to take me. I woke up in the dark, my body aching as though I'd been asleep for days. For a long moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I had gotten there. The air around me felt wrong, too still, too cold. There was a thick, suffocating heaviness in the room, like something pressing down on me from all sides. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt sluggish, as if I was underwater. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the darkness that surrounded me. There were no familiar sounds, no wind rustling outside, no creaking floorboards, nothing that made sense. Then I remembered. The woman in black. The knock on the door. The fear hit me again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a sudden rush of panic, but a slow, creeping dread, like a poison working its way through my veins. I didn't need to see her to know she was near. I could feel her, like a shadow hanging over me, a presence that had wrapped itself around my soul. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. My eyes searched the room, trying to find something, anything, to prove that I was still in control. But there was nothing, only the crushing dark and that suffocating stillness. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. You're here now. The words came from the corner of the room, but I couldn't see her. She was hidden, like a ghost lingering just outside the reach of my vision. But I could feel her. Her presence was stronger than ever, filling every inch of the space. My heart raced, but no matter how hard I tried, my body refused to respond. My legs felt paralyzed. I was trapped. Trapped in this place, with her. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The walls seemed to close in, and I could hear the soft, rhythmic tapping of something against the floor. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was walking closer. She was circling me, toying with me. I could feel the pressure, the weight of her gaze, like she was right there, watching me, waiting. And then I heard her voice again, a low murmur that sent a chill down my spine. "You can never leave." I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My chest tightened, my throat closing up as though the air itself was being stolen from me. My mind screamed for me to move, to get away, but my body was no longer mine to command. I was frozen. Everything around me felt unreal, like a nightmare that had come to life, a world where nothing was safe, where there was no escape. I could feel her now, standing right in front of me, but I still couldn't see her. Her presence was a suffocating force, and I could feel the cold of it cutting through me like a knife. And then, something shifted. I could see her. Not with my eyes, but in my mind's eye. The woman in black, standing tall and still, her face hidden beneath the veil. Her figure was a dark silhouette against the oppressive blackness that surrounded us. Her presence was overwhelming, and I could feel the weight of her being, the power she held over me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped in her gaze, in the stillness of the moment. The woman took a slow step toward me, and I could feel the ground beneath me shift, the air around me thickening. She moved closer, her veil fluttering with each step. The cold radiated from her, an icy chill that burned through my skin, making my bones ache. "Now, you'll stay," she whispered, her voice a low, haunting sound that seemed to reverberate in my chest. My heart raced, and finally, the terror broke free from my chest, filling me with the desperate need to escape. I tried to move, but my body refused to cooperate. The fear had taken hold of me, shackling me to the spot. She was too close now. I could feel her presence filling the room, suffocating me with her power. "I'll never leave," she said, her words more certain than before. I tried to speak, but my voice was gone. My throat felt tight, constricted, as if something was choking me from the inside. There was no way out. I was trapped, surrounded by darkness, by her. And in that moment, I knew. The crossroads weren't just a place. They were a point of no return. I was never meant to leave. And now, I was hers. Forever. The woman in black had taken me, and I would never escape. The Dark Pass in Nevada. It was late when I took the turn off the main highway, heading for a small town in Nevada. I was exhausted from the long drive, the kind of tired that made everything blur together, the monotony of the road, the dull hum of the engine, the faint buzz of the radio. I'd heard rumors about this stretch of highway before. People said it was cursed, that something lingered in the desert, something that wasn't quite right. But I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I was just passing through, looking to get a good night's rest before pushing on in the morning. The road was empty, just the sound of my tires crunching over the gravel, the occasional howl of the wind. But something felt off. Maybe it was the desert night, so vast and endless, or maybe it was just the isolation. You get used to it out here, the long stretches of road with nothing but the occasional gas station or truck stop. But tonight, it was different. The air felt heavier, as if the world around me was holding its breath. I had driven for miles without seeing another car. The headlights sliced through the darkness, but they didn't seem to reach far enough, as if the darkness stretched on forever. It was the kind of emptiness that made your mind start to play tricks on you. That's why I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, some trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. A figure stood by the side of the road, just off the shoulder, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. It was a woman, at least, it looked like a woman. She was wearing a long black dress, her hair wild in the wind, but there was something strange about her. Something that didn't sit right. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but her eyes, they glowed. I slowed down, my foot hovering over the brake. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge me as I came closer. She just stood there, staring at nothing, her eyes glowing bright against the darkness. I don't know why, but I felt a chill run through me. The kind of chill that makes your skin prickle, makes you want to turn around and run. But I didn't. I kept driving, my eyes still on her, and just as I passed her, something strange happened. The air grew colder. A gust of wind slammed into the car, rattling the windows, and I heard a faint sound, a whisper. I turned my head to look in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind me. But that's not what I saw. The woman was gone. In her place were strange, deep impressions in the dirt, footprints, perhaps, but they weren't like any footprints I'd ever seen. They were too large, too deep, like something heavy had been standing there. The kind of prints that suggested something unnatural had been in that spot. I looked back out the windshield, heart pounding in my chest. The road was empty again, the wind still howling, but it felt wrong. I should have turned around then. Should have gone back to the highway, gone straight to the nearest town. But I didn't. I kept driving. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something was following me. The sensation of eyes on my back, burning into me. But when I glanced in the mirror again, there was nothing there. Just the empty stretch of desert road, the endless night ahead of me. Still, I couldn't shake the fear in my gut. Something was out there. Something I couldn't see. And I was certain as I'd ever been, that I wasn't alone. The miles stretched on, the dark highway seemingly endless. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles pale in the dim light. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the image of the woman lingered in my mind, her glowing eyes flashing every time I closed my eyes. The air in the car felt heavier now, thick with an unease I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. I had just imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the shadows, or my exhaustion playing with my mind. I'd been on the road for hours, and the isolation of the desert could make anyone start seeing things. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't push the feeling of dread that weighed on me. Then, just as I thought I might finally be calming down, it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker, something on the side of the road, barely visible in the headlights. My breath caught in my throat as I looked toward it. The figure was there again. The woman in the black dress. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the gravel. The car jerked to a stop, and I stared in disbelief at the figure standing on the roadside, no more than 50 feet away. How was she here again? I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. There she was, standing in the same spot as before, her face hidden, her eyes glowing like embers in the night. The wind had picked up again, swirling around her, making her dress flutter as if it was alive. What the hell was going on? I didn't even think about it. I put the car in reverse and began backing up. I needed to get away from her. I had to. But no matter how far I drove in reverse, the woman remained in place. I was stuck in this strange loop, as if the world had twisted around me, trapping me in this moment. Every time I looked up, she was still there, her presence growing stronger, more suffocating. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I shifted the car back into drive. My foot hit the gas, and I sped forward, the engine roaring as I tried to put distance between us. The headlights illuminated the empty road, but I could feel her presence in the air, in the darkness. It was as if she was still right there, just beyond the reach of the light. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the darkness behind me, something fast, something wrong. But it was gone before I could focus on it, leaving only the swirling shadows of the desert. My heart hammered in my chest. Was it her? Was she following me? I dared to glance over my shoulder again, and this time I saw it clearly. There was a shape moving in the distance. Not a person, but something larger, something unnatural. It was moving fast, too fast for a person, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something was coming for me. I tried to speed up, but the road stretched on endlessly, the desert unchanging, the night swallowing everything whole. The shape in the rearview mirror grew larger, closing the distance between us. It was too fast to be a car, too fast to be anything normal. Panic surged through me as I slammed the pedal to the floor. The car surged forward, but the shape was still gaining on me, faster and faster, until I could see it clearly, something with glowing eyes, just like the woman. But this wasn't her. It was something else. Something worse. I was trapped. The road ahead of me seemed to narrow, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I looked around, desperate for a sign of life, for another car, for anything that might break the eerie silence that was closing in. But there was nothing. No other lights, no other souls, just me, the road, and the thing chasing me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I glanced in the mirror one more time. The glowing eyes were getting closer, too close. I slammed my foot on the brakes, jerking the wheel to the side, sending the car skidding across the gravel as I tried to outrun whatever was after me. But it wasn't enough. The car spun out of control, the world blurring around me as I tried to right it. In the chaos, I heard something, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. I turned the wheel desperately, trying to regain control, but it was no use. And then, everything went dark. I woke to the sound of nothing. Complete silence. The kind that wraps around you like a thick, suffocating blanket. I blinked a few times, disoriented, my head pounding. My fingers trembled as they reached up to touch the steering wheel. I was still in the car, but something was wrong. The engine wasn't running, the lights were out, and the world outside was completely black. My heart began to race. What had happened? How did I get here? I looked around, but there was nothing to see. The road was gone. The car had come to a stop, but I wasn't sure where. The last thing I remembered was the screech of the tires as I lost control, but now it was as if the world had swallowed me whole. The faint scent of burnt rubber lingered in the air, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the thick, stagnant smell of the desert night. I couldn't hear a single sound, not even the usual wind that swept through these open roads. It was as if I was in a vacuum, cut off from the rest of the world. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, something made me freeze. A shadow. A shape, dark and unnatural, moved just outside the car. It wasn't human, not in any way that I could explain. It shifted with a fluidity that made my stomach churn, and the air around it seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't comprehend. My breath hitched as I slowly turned my head to peer through the windshield. In the distance, a faint glow pierced the darkness. At first, it seemed like a light, maybe from a distant town, but then I realized the truth. It was eyes. Two glowing orbs floating in the night. The figure was there again. But this time, it wasn't just standing by the side of the road. It was moving toward me. I felt my body freeze, unable to move, unable to think. The eyes were locked on me, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears. I couldn't breathe. Slowly, the figure drew closer, its movements almost too fluid to be real. As it neared, I saw the outline of its body, tall, thin, shrouded in darkness. The black dress swayed with every movement, but it wasn't the dress that terrified me. It was the way it moved, the way it didn't seem to walk so much as glide, as if it was part of the very air itself. I glanced around the car, searching for a way to escape, but there was nothing. The doors were locked, the windows rolled up. The car, now a cage, offered no protection. The figure stopped just in front of the vehicle, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. There was no sound, no wind, no movement, only the suffocating presence of something ancient, something beyond human. I couldn't look away. It was as if it was pulling me in, drawing me into its dark, endless void. And then, with a sudden and violent force, the car rocked. It felt like a sudden jolt of electricity had coursed through the vehicle, and I gasped, my hands flying to the door handles. But they didn't open. I yanked harder, my heart racing, panic surging through me. But no matter how hard I tried, the door wouldn't budge. The glow of the figure's eyes intensified. I could hear the faintest whisper now, too soft for me to make out the words, but its tone was enough. It wasn't a voice, it was an echo, a haunting sound that reverberated deep inside my skull. It was coming for me. The car shuddered again, this time violently, as if something had just slammed into it. I screamed, my panic rising to a fever pitch, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. And then, I heard it clearly. A whisper, cold and dark, "You can't leave." The words cut through me like a knife, freezing me in place. I tried to move, to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I was trapped. Trapped in a world of darkness, with no way out. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a bad dream. This wasn't just a hallucination or a trick of the mind. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just trying to scare me. It was trying to take me. And it wasn't going to let me go. The figure reached out, its long, twisted fingers brushing against the side of the car. The metal screamed as it made contact, a sound that made my teeth rattle. The window began to crack, spiderwebbing with eerie slowness, as though time itself was slowing down. I was going to die here. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's face. The eyes glowed brighter, and I could just make out its features, pale skin stretched tightly over a hollow skull, lips twisted in a smile that didn't reach its eyes. Its face was like a mask, but one that was somehow worse for the lack of emotion. It wasn't alive, it wasn't dead. It was something worse. Something in between. Then, everything went silent. And the darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been minutes, hours, or days. When I finally awoke, the first thing I noticed was the weight on my chest, heavier than any sleep or fatigue I'd ever felt. The air was thick, like I was underwater, and my body felt drained, as though something had sucked all the life out of me. I blinked, trying to focus, but the world was a blur. The sharp scent of burned rubber still lingered in the air, mixing with the dry, acrid taste of dust. My mouth was dry, cracked, and every part of me felt stiff, like I'd been in a deep sleep for far too long. But I hadn't slept. I had been trapped. I sat up slowly, my head pounding with every movement. The car was still there. The engine was still off. But the night had changed. The darkness wasn't as suffocating as before, but there was a coldness that made my skin crawl. I tried the door again. This time, it opened. I staggered out of the car, my legs shaky beneath me. The moonlight cut through the vast desert, casting long shadows across the road. The world around me was eerily still, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. The desert stretched out before me, the endless expanse of dirt and rock, silent and unforgiving. But even in the moonlight, the shape of the mountains ahead seemed wrong. Their jagged peaks loomed unnaturally tall against the sky, and the road before me seemed to wind in strange, impossible directions. I took a step forward, then another. But each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground beneath me was pushing back. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the glowing eyes again. But there was nothing. Nothing except the sound of my own breath, ragged and too loud in the silence. And then I heard it. A distant screech, like metal on metal. But it wasn't coming from the car, it was coming from behind me, from the dark expanse of the road that stretched out toward the mountains. I froze. The screech was followed by the faintest sound, a whisper carried by the wind. It was too soft to understand, but the feeling it gave me was unmistakable. It was coming closer. I turned around, my heart racing, but I couldn't see anything in the distance. The road ahead was empty. But the whispering, it was real. It was right behind me. My breath caught in my throat. There was a presence here, just beyond my reach, but I couldn't see it. I looked down, noticing that the ground beneath me had begun to shift. I could see tracks, deep grooves carved into the dirt, as though something heavy had passed over it. But the tracks weren't from any vehicle I knew. They were too wide, too deep. And they didn't go straight. They circled back, like a predator stalking its prey. I couldn't explain it. My mind was scrambling to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation, no logic to this nightmare. Another screech. This time closer. I spun around, instinctively moving to the side of the road, my eyes scanning the darkness, desperate for any sign of movement. But the road remained still, like a lifeless stretch of nothingness. It's just your mind playing tricks, I told myself, but the words felt empty. I was already questioning my own sanity. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before whatever this was caught me. But the moment I took a step forward, I heard something else. A faint, guttural growl, barely audible over the wind. I froze, panic seizing my chest. I turned slowly. And there, standing at the edge of the road, was the figure. It was only a silhouette, but it was unmistakable. That same twisted, unnatural shape, its body shrouded in darkness, eyes glowing faintly, like embers in the night. I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, my body locked in place by a terror I couldn't fight. It was real. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was here. And it was watching me. The figure didn't move. It stood still, its glowing eyes fixed on me, and in that moment, I knew it was in control now. It wasn't going to let me leave. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear my pulse thumping in my ears. There was no way out. The road stretched endlessly before me, but every direction felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to hide something worse than the last. I stumbled back, my hands reaching out for something, anything that could protect me. But there was nothing. Just the open desert and that suffocating silence. Then the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately. It stepped forward, its footfall silent but sure. Each step seemed to push the world around me into sharper focus. The air grew heavier, the very ground beneath my feet trembling with each movement. I took a few unsteady steps backward, my heart pounding, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. I could feel it now, not just watching me, but reaching out to me. Its presence was everywhere. It knows you're here, I thought, my mind racing. It knows everything. Then, as if in response to my fear, the figure lunged. A sound tore through the night, a sharp, unnatural shriek that vibrated the very air around me. The ground shook violently, and I could feel the wind kick up, swirling around me in violent gusts. I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of the wind, but I didn't stop running. I had to get away. I had to survive. But as I turned to run, I heard it. A voice, low and chilling, whispering just behind me. "You can't escape." And the chase began. My feet were pounding the dusty road, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. The figure, whatever it was close now. I could feel it, a presence right behind me, its cold breath on my neck. The wind howled in my ears, drowning out everything except that creeping, suffocating feeling that something monstrous was on my tail. Don't look back, I told myself, but my body betrayed me. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse of the dark silhouette. It was closer now, too close. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, fiery light, and its form seemed to flicker in and out of reality, as if it was never truly there. I ran faster, my legs aching, but they carried me forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. The road stretched on, but the end was nowhere in sight. No lights, no sign of civilization. Just endless desert. How much longer? My mind screamed, but my body didn't have an answer. I could feel its presence now, pressing in from all sides. The whispers, those terrible, incoherent whispers, were all around me, in my ears, inside my head. They were like a swarm of insects, crawling under my skin, filling me with a gnawing sense of dread I couldn't escape. Suddenly, my foot caught on something, rough, uneven ground. I tripped, falling hard onto the asphalt. Pain shot through my knees and palms, but I didn't stop. I scrambled up as quickly as I could, blood already mixing with the dirt on my hands. The figure was still there, a shadow against the night, moving closer. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I gasped out loud, my voice trembling with fear. The words were a plea, but I knew deep down it was pointless. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something that didn't understand mercy or fear. The ground trembled again, more violently this time. I heard a screech, a sound so awful that it felt like it was tearing through my very soul. It was coming closer. The footsteps were loud now, deafening, as if the creature was running alongside me, matching my pace. It's going to catch me, I thought, but my legs refused to stop. I couldn't stop. I glanced over my shoulder again, and this time, I saw it. The figure wasn't just standing anymore. It was running after me, faster than I could ever have imagined. Its legs were too long, its body bending in unnatural ways, and its glowing eyes, those burning, fiery eyes, focused solely on me. The distance between us was closing rapidly, the air between us thick with dread and an unbearable heat. Panic surged through me. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I had to get away, but I didn't know how. The road stretched on, endless, unforgiving. There was nothing but desert, no way out. Then, in a fleeting moment of clarity, I remembered something. I remembered the tracks, the deep grooves in the dirt. The figure had left them. There was something it was doing, something it wanted from me. The road, I realized. The road is its domain. It was trapping me here, running me in circles, forcing me toward the mountains. The mountains were its boundary. My heart raced faster as I forced myself to focus. I had to turn back. I had to reach the car. The only chance I had was to make it back to the vehicle, to the place where I could fight back, if that was even possible. I turned sharply, pushing my aching body into an unnatural sprint. The figure screamed behind me, a terrifying wail that echoed across the desert, but I didn't look back this time. My mind was focused solely on the car. With every step, the sound of its footsteps grew louder. I was losing ground. It was gaining on me, closing the gap with every second. The heat from its presence was overwhelming now, the air around me distorting as if the very earth was bending to its will. But I could see it. The headlights of my car were just ahead. I was almost there. I reached the vehicle, my hand shaking as I grabbed for the door. The handle wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it stayed locked. Panic set in, and my mind was a swirl of chaos. It couldn't be locked. It shouldn't be locked. No, no, no. Then, I heard it, the sound of the creature's breath, sharp and heavy, just behind me. It was too close. I could feel the heat radiating off its body. It was here. It was right behind me. Without thinking, I slammed my shoulder against the door, throwing all my weight into it. This time, the door gave way, creaking open just enough for me to slip inside. I dove into the car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled for the keys, my hands trembling violently. The creature's screech was so close now, I could feel the vibrations through the floor of the car. I started the engine. The roar of the engine was deafening, but it was the sound of salvation. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the tires squealing as I sped away. The figure was still there, standing in the middle of the road, watching me. Its glowing eyes burned into the rearview mirror as I sped past. The road stretched out before me, empty and barren, but the sense of being hunted didn't leave. I could still feel its eyes on me, its presence lingering, as if it was never truly gone. But I'm still alive, I thought, though the words felt hollow. The night was silent, but the dread never went away. I couldn't shake the feeling that the chase had only just begun. Wyoming's Lake of Horror. The sound of the boat's motor hummed low, its steady drone breaking the silence of the vast Wyoming lake. I had always loved coming out here, to the remote waters of Hell's Hollow Lake, where I could fish in peace and solitude. It was a place few visited, especially this time of year, with the autumn chill creeping into the air, warning that winter was near. I had been here more times than I could count. The lake's stillness always felt like a refuge, a place where time slowed down. But tonight, something felt off. The air was heavy, and the usual quiet hum of the world seemed muted. The wind barely stirred the water, and I noticed an eerie stillness hanging over everything. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in nature, where everything is waiting for you to make a sound. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was listening. I glanced around the boat. The night sky above was clear, full of stars, but the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. That made everything darker, colder. The lake, usually shimmering under moonlight, now looked like a vast, black mirror stretching endlessly. Then, I saw them. A group of figures standing motionless on the surface of the water, far ahead. They weren't moving, just standing there, perfectly still. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Maybe a few rocks poking above the surface. But no, there was something wrong about them. Their shapes were too tall, too unnatural. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't tell what they were. I shook my head. It's nothing, I told myself. Just my imagination. But as I steered the boat closer, the figures didn't disappear. They remained rigid, like dark silhouettes against the black water. And that's when the unease started to settle in. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to get closer, but something pulled me in. Curiosity, or was it something else? There was a strange pull on my chest, like I needed to see them up close. The boat moved forward slowly, cutting through the water with an unnatural stillness. The figures remained perfectly still, not even a ripple around them. I could feel my heart beginning to race. The closer I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. It was like they were watching me. But no! That's absurd, I told myself. There's no one out here. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I couldn't control. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe, like I was suffocating under some invisible weight. I looked back once, just to check the shoreline, to assure myself that I wasn't lost in my thoughts. But when I turned forward again, one of the figures had moved. No, it couldn't be. I hadn't seen it move. It had to be an illusion. It had to be. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was just the dim light playing tricks on me. But when I opened them again, the figure was no longer standing still. It was closer. Its outline seemed sharper, more defined, and its shape, though human-like, was twisted. I could feel its presence now, like a shadow creeping over the boat. It's just my mind playing tricks, I thought. Just stay calm. But then, the boat lurched forward, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the surface of the water. It was faint at first, but then the sound grew louder, like something was scraping across the lake bed, sending shivers up my spine. I stopped the engine, too afraid to move forward. There was no other sound now except the low scrape that seemed to come from beneath the boat. Something was underneath. Something was there. The figure in front of me remained frozen, but the others had started to move, too. Their heads turned in unison, slowly, as if they were following my every move. They were watching me. All of them. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My hands were cold, shaking against the oar. What were these things? Were they real? The boat rocked gently from side to side as the figures continued to watch. Then, something strange happened. As I stared at them, the surface of the water around them began to shift, and for a moment, I could swear I saw images. Images from the past. There was a woman, her face twisted in agony, her hands outstretched. A scream that I could almost hear, but there was no sound. Then, a flash of a man, standing over a body, blood dripping from his hands. Another scream. The visions flickered, fast and disorienting, but they all seemed to connect with the figures. The more I looked at them, the clearer the images became, and I realized that I wasn't seeing just the past of the lake, I was seeing their past. These figures, these ghostly apparitions, were connected to something much darker. The figures were trapped, and I was being pulled into their nightmare. My heart pounded. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. I didn't know what these things were, but I had seen enough. But before I could start the motor, I felt it. The weight. The pressure. Like something was pressing down on me. The boat rocked violently, and the figures were no longer just standing. They were moving toward me, slowly at first, but gaining speed. The water rippled unnaturally as they glided forward, their faces, or what I could make out of them, twisted in grotesque expressions. I knew I had to escape, but as I turned the motor on and tried to speed away, the boat refused to move. It was as if something beneath the water was holding it back, pulling it down. The shadows were closer now, their forms almost solid in the dim light. And as they closed in, the world around me seemed to fade, leaving nothing but the sound of my pounding heart and the relentless, scraping noise from the depths below. I was not alone anymore. And whatever they were not letting me leave. The boat lurched again, and my hands gripped the oar, knuckles white from the effort. The engine sputtered, its low hum the only sound in the thick, suffocating silence. The figures on the water had come closer, their shapes now unmistakable. They were tall, almost unnaturally so, with lanky limbs and faces that seemed to blur in and out of focus. Their eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed faintly, like embers, cold and lifeless. I tried the engine again, desperate. The motor sputtered once more, then died entirely, leaving me stranded in the middle of the lake with no way to escape. This isn't real, I thought, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. It's just the dark playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind. The water was still too quiet, the atmosphere too oppressive, too heavy. I glanced at the shore. It was too far to swim. No one would be able to hear me if I screamed. The figures were circling now, moving closer, their movements unnervingly slow. I tried not to look at them, tried to focus on anything else, the small, rippling waves, the faint sound of the boat scraping against the water. But my eyes were drawn back to them, as if some unseen force was pulling me toward their unblinking gaze. One of the figures, its shape dark and indistinct, stepped out into the water, not with legs, but gliding like it was floating just above the surface. The others followed, all of them moving toward me. There was something about their approach that made my blood run cold. They were not human, there was no way they could be. And then, I saw it. The faintest trace of something beneath the water, stretching out toward the boat. A dark shape, longer than any shadow should be, slithering through the lake like a serpent. My stomach twisted in terror, and I realized that whatever these figures were, they were connected to something far older and far darker than I could understand. Get a grip, I told myself, forcing my hand to the boat's motor again. I wasn't going to die out here. Not like this. The motor roared to life with a jolt, and I pushed the throttle forward, eager to escape. The boat jerked violently, then surged ahead, cutting through the water. The figures, those strange, silent watchers, remained behind, standing like statues. But I could still feel them. Their eyes. They were watching me. And they were not alone. The eerie scraping sound from beneath the boat returned, louder this time. A grinding noise that seemed to come from the very depths of the lake, and I felt the water around me grow colder. So much colder. It was as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. I tried to focus on the water ahead, but it was hard to ignore the sense of unease creeping in again. It wasn't just the figures. Something was wrong with the water itself. I could feel it, a pull, a weight pulling me down, trying to drag me into the dark depths. I can make it to the shore, I thought desperately. Just get to the shore. But no matter how fast I pushed the boat forward, it felt as though I was getting nowhere. The shoreline was still miles away, and the air was thick with an unexplainable pressure that made my chest tighten with each breath. The scraping noise grew louder, and I looked back again. The figures were no longer stationary. They were moving faster, almost running now, gliding across the water toward me. But they weren't moving like anything human. They were shifting, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their faces twisting into grotesque, contorted shapes. I could feel the water beneath me moving, shifting, something powerful stirring in the depths. The surface of the lake began to ripple, and I swore I saw shadows swirling beneath the water, dark forms reaching upward toward the boat. A scream caught in my throat, but I couldn't make a sound. My pulse was racing, and my hands trembled violently as I tried to steer the boat, but it felt as though the lake itself was resisting. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. And then, just as I thought I might be free, the boat lurched violently again, tipping to one side. I was thrown from my seat, slamming against the side of the boat, gasping for air. No, I thought, struggling to my knees. No, no, no. The boat was sinking. Slowly but surely, the water was pulling it down. I looked around in a panic, but I could barely make sense of what was happening. The figures were upon me now, their glowing eyes fixed on mine, their twisted faces grinning in silence. They had no mouths, but I could hear their laughter in my mind, echoing in cold, like the wind howling through an empty graveyard. I reached out, grabbing onto the side of the boat, trying to keep myself from being dragged under. But it was useless. The water was pulling me in now, too. I could feel it, thick and suffocating, closing in around my legs. I kicked, but it didn't matter. Something was grabbing me from below, dragging me down. My breath came in sharp gasps, the pressure increasing, squeezing my chest until it felt like my ribs might crack. I tried to scream, but the water filled my mouth, choking me. And then, as I sank deeper, my vision blurred, and I saw them again. The figures. But now, they were standing beside me, watching silently as the water swallowed me whole. This is it, I thought in despair, as my body went numb. But just as I thought I had lost all hope, a thought struck me. If I can't escape the lake, maybe I can escape the vision. I closed my eyes, willing myself to fight it, to break free from the nightmare. If I survive this, I'll never come back. Never again. But the darkness pressed in, and I knew it was too late. I don't know how long I was submerged in the lake, time slipping away in a blur of cold, darkness, and suffocating silence. It felt like an eternity, the weight of the water pressing in from all sides, dragging me deeper into its grasp. But then, something shifted. The pressure lightened. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, I thought I had escaped. The water around me was calm, eerily still, and the once dark lake had transformed into a pale, ghostly reflection of the sky above. The figures had vanished, their oppressive presence replaced by a haunting stillness. But I was not alone. I was standing, not sinking, on the surface of the water, my feet solid on the lake bed, yet the water did not touch me. It was as if the lake had become a mirror, reflecting the world in twisted fragments. My breath came shallow, and my heart raced as I tried to understand what was happening. But then, the whispers began. It was faint at first, a soft murmur in the distance. I turned slowly, my eyes searching for the source, but all I saw were the ripples in the water, distorted and strange. The voices grew louder until they were all around me, their words indecipherable yet somehow familiar. A name floated to the surface of my mind, a name I couldn't place, but somehow knew. Lillian. I spun around, heart pounding. There, standing just a few feet away, was a figure. A woman. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her hair dark and tangled, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes, though, were wide open, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Lillian, I whispered without thinking, the name slipping from my lips as if it had been there all along. She didn't speak, but she nodded slowly, the motion too slow, too deliberate. Her eyes never left mine, her face expressionless. She took a step toward me, and the water beneath her feet rippled, but she didn't sink. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the lake itself had frozen me in place. The whispers around me grew louder, more frantic, and the air seemed to vibrate with an energy I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the vision changed. The reflection of the sky began to twist, the clouds darkening into stormy swirls. The pale, glassy water turned murky and thick, like the ground had cracked open and spilled its contents. The shadows on the lake's surface grew darker, longer, and the figure of Lillian morphed before my eyes. Her skin began to decay, her clothes ripping apart, exposing a skeletal frame. Her eyes, once filled with silent dread, now glowed with an unnatural light, the pupils no longer human. The whispers became screams, loud and deafening, but still unintelligible, as if they were trying to tell me something, warn me. And then, I saw it. Beneath the surface of the lake, a face, a twisted, grotesque face, submerged in the water, its eyes wide open, staring up at me. It was as though the face was waiting, watching, and the longer I looked at it, the more familiar it became. The features were distorted, but I could see the outline of a mouth, the shape of a nose, the hollow cheeks. It's me, I realized in a moment of horror. That's my face. The figure of Lillian was now towering over me, her voice rising from the depths of my own subconscious, her words clearer than before, yet still incomprehensible. But they had meaning. I could feel them clawing at my mind. The lake, the voice of Lillian seemed to echo through the water. The water remembers. The past is alive. The words sent a shiver down my spine. The past? What did she mean? The water began to move around me, swirling in violent currents. It felt alive, like it was reaching out for me, pulling me down into the depths. The face in the water, my own face, grinned at me, a grin filled with malice and dread. No, I thought, panic flooding my chest. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But the more I struggled, the more real it became. The water, thick and heavy, pressed against me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper. The sky above grew darker, and the figure of Lillian was now standing just inches away, her face twisted in an expression of silent rage. And then, I heard the final whisper. You are one of us. The lake, the faces, the past, it all merged into one overwhelming, crushing force. My vision blurred again, but this time I could hear the water's cold grip pulling me down, deeper and deeper. And then, there was nothing. When I finally woke, gasping for air, I was back on the shore. The boat was still in its place, rocking gently in the water. The lake was silent again, its surface calm. but the weight of what I had experienced lingered. A cold hand pressed against my chest. I wasn't alone. The figure of Lillian stood at the edge of the lake, watching. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light of the setting sun. "You can't escape the lake," her voice whispered in my mind. "The lake remembers." And the last thing I saw before my vision faded to black were those glowing eyes, staring into my soul. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure if I had truly woken up. The world around me was too quiet, too still. The fading light of day seemed to stretch unnaturally, casting long shadows over the water, turning everything into a muted gray. My body felt heavy, drained, as though the lake itself had seeped into my very bones. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the lingering fog of the dream or nightmare, whichever it had been. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the cold weight pressing against me. I looked around, expecting the lake to be calm, to be empty. But the surface of the water was far from still. The figures were back. Just like before, they stood on the water, silent and unmoving. There were more of them this time, 4, maybe 5, and they were closer to the shore. Their forms were indistinct, like dark silhouettes against the gray sky, their features hidden beneath the thick fog that had settled around the lake. But I could feel them, feel their eyes on me, even from this distance. A shiver ran down my spine. No. Not again. I had to leave, had to get away from this place. But my legs felt like lead, and my mind was clouded with the images I had seen. The face beneath the water. My face. Lillian's voice, her words echoing in my mind. The lake remembers. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I needed to get in the boat, start the engine, and leave this cursed place. But the more I tried to focus on the task, the more the figures seemed to move closer. They didn't walk, not in the traditional sense. They glided over the water, their motions too smooth, too unnatural. "This isn't happening," I told myself, my voice shaky. "I'm just imagining it. This is just a dream." But the fear inside me was too real to deny. My pulse quickened, and I glanced around, desperate for any sign of safety. The shoreline seemed to stretch out into the distance, empty, devoid of anything familiar. The boat was the only thing anchoring me to reality, but even that seemed distant, as if it were slipping further away the longer I stood frozen. And then I heard it. A low whisper, almost like a breath on the wind. It wasn't coming from any one figure, it was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the air like a cold mist. "Come closer." The voice was unmistakable. It was Lillian's. But it was different this time. The calmness had been replaced with an unsettling pull, a beckoning that tugged at the deepest part of my mind, urging me to move toward the water. "No!" I screamed inside my head, my feet unwilling to move. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the boat, but my body remained rooted to the shore. The figures in the water had stopped moving, but I could feel them. No! I could feel it, getting closer. It was as if the lake itself was alive, watching, waiting, ready to drag me back down. "The past is alive," Lillian's voice whispered again, and the words seemed to rattle through my very bones. I looked at the water, the surface now completely still. The figures were gone. The whispering stopped. Everything was silent again. But the silence felt wrong, unnatural. Suddenly, I was struck by the thought, the feeling, that something had been left behind. Something was waiting for me. A memory, a part of myself I had forgotten. With trembling hands, I turned and grabbed the oar from the boat, trying to steady my mind. I couldn't leave. Not without answers. I pushed the boat out into the water, the engine sputtering to life, a harsh sound that broke the unnatural stillness. As I pulled farther from the shore, the figures appeared once more, this time standing in a perfect line, like a welcoming party. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head and met their gaze. And in that instant, everything shifted. The water began to churn violently, the surface splitting open like a wound. Dark, swirling shapes rose from the depths, reaching for the sky like skeletal hands. A terrible roar filled the air, not from the figures, but from something deep within the lake itself. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the sides of the boat as the water around me seemed to swallow the light. It was too much. Too much to comprehend. But I could feel it, the truth, creeping into my mind like a poison. This is no longer just a lake. The words, clear and cold, whispered through my thoughts. It is a prison, and you are its prisoner. Suddenly, the boat lurched, and I was thrown into the water. The shock of the cold hit me like a blow, but it wasn't the water that paralyzed me. It was the realization, the understanding that I had never left. I had always been here. The water enveloped me, cold and suffocating, dragging me under with an unnatural force. My lungs screamed for air, but there was no escape. The darkness below was thick, like the depths of some ancient, cursed abyss. The surface above was a distant memory, a fading glimmer of light I couldn't reach. My heart raced, but I felt the cold calmness of inevitability settle over me, as if something far older than I could comprehend was watching, waiting. I clawed at the water, desperate to swim, but the weight pulling me down was unbearable. My body felt heavy, like the lake itself was intent on drowning me, erasing me from existence. In the murky depths, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Figures. Pale, indistinct, but their eyes burned with an unearthly glow, as if they could see into the very core of my being. They circled around me like vultures, their faces warped and twisted, but I knew one thing, they weren't alive. They were memories. Shadows of the past, imprisoned here by the lake's insidious curse. Lillian, I thought, my mind racing through the haze of fear and confusion. She's here too. A cold laugh echoed in my ears, and I realized it wasn't just the figures I could hear. It was the whispers, the voices of everyone who had ever disappeared here. The souls trapped by the lake, forever reliving their final moments. We were all deceived, one voice whispered, barely audible. The lake calls. The lake takes. I kicked furiously, my breath coming in desperate gasps, but it was useless. The figures were closer now, their forms becoming clearer, more solid. One of them reached for me, a long, bony hand that seemed to stretch across the dark waters like a spider's web. I flinched away, but there was no escape. They were everywhere. Suddenly, a powerful force surged through the water, pulling me downward with crushing pressure. I fought against it, my body screaming in resistance, but my arms were weak, my legs no longer obeying. I looked up, my vision blurring as I saw the surface of the water slipping further and further away, and in that instant, I knew that no matter how hard I struggled, I would never break free. The memories came crashing in, unbidden, violent. I saw flashes of Lillian's face, her eyes wide with terror as the water claimed her, her hand reaching out to me one last time. I saw the figures on the surface of the lake, beckoning me closer, pulling me in with promises of salvation, promises that were all lies. And then, I saw myself. The truth hit me like a jolt of ice. I wasn't just a witness. I wasn't just another victim. I had been here before. I had come to this lake just like all the others, and I had been consumed by it. The whispers I heard, the cold grip of fear, the figures on the water, all of it, it wasn't a curse from the past. It was a cycle. A never-ending loop where the lake took and took and took until nothing was left. My own face stared back at me through the water, the reflection twisted and distorted. The lake had already claimed me. And now it was calling me home. The pressure on my chest intensified, and the last remnants of air escaped my lungs. The lake was closing in around me, dark and endless. There was no escaping it. I was no longer a witness. I was one of them, a part of the lake's eternal hunger. And as the darkness consumed me, I realized that the lake had already won. The next day, the sun rose over the same calm waters, the figures on the surface absent once again. Another boat would pass by soon. Another soul would find themselves trapped in the lake's embrace, just like I had. The cycle would begin again, and the lake would wait. The Phantom Stream in Montana. I had been hiking through the dense forests of Montana for hours, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. It was the kind of peaceful silence that you could only find far from civilization, where the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. But as I walked deeper into the woods, something felt wrong, something I couldn't quite explain. At first, it was faint, a soft, distant sound that seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't the normal rustle of leaves or the chirping of animals. It was water. The sound of a stream flowing gently, as though the water was just around the corner. But when I glanced in that direction, all I saw was a thick wall of trees and underbrush. The sound grew louder, almost beckoning me forward, as if the stream were close, yet I still couldn't find it. I paused, my breath shallow. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, the forest could play tricks on you with its rustling branches and shifting shadows. But no, there it was again, clearer this time, the unmistakable murmur of water moving over rocks, the soft gurgling that one would expect to hear from a stream running through a forest. I hesitated. I had been in these woods before, and there were no streams around here. Not for miles. Curiosity gnawed at me. I had to find it. I pushed through the dense underbrush, following the sound, my heart quickening with each step. The closer I got, the stronger the sound became. It was like the stream was just ahead, waiting for me to discover it. But as I rounded the next bend, the sound stopped abruptly. My steps faltered. The air around me felt heavier, the forest eerily quiet. I stood there for a moment, listening, my breath catching in my chest. Nothing. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just silence. Then I heard it again. The sound of water, only this time it was different, closer, more urgent, as though the stream was now right next to me. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. No stream. No water. I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no sign of the stream, but the sound was unmistakable. It seemed to be moving, shifting around me, as though the stream was following me. Am I hearing things? I whispered to myself, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. It's just the woods. It's just the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The sound of the stream was so clear, so real, yet I couldn't find it. And the way it followed me, never letting me catch up to it, felt almost deliberate. I turned back toward the trail, deciding to head back to the clearing where I had started. But as I did, I heard it again, the sound of rushing water, only this time it was louder. Almost as if the stream was right behind me. My pulse quickened. I froze, my body tensing, as I spun around. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and stretch. But still, there was no stream, no water in sight. Only the sound echoing around me, growing louder and louder with each passing second. Okay, this isn't funny anymore, I muttered under my breath, anxiety rising in my chest. What the hell is going on? It wasn't just the sound. There was something about the air around me that felt wrong. The trees felt closer, the shadows deeper, the forest more suffocating. I could hear the faintest whisper now, carried by the wind, like a voice murmuring just out of reach. Get out. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Get out now. I took a step back, my heart racing. The whispers were growing louder now, overlapping with the sound of the stream until they were indistinguishable from each other. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears as the panic began to set in. The forest was no longer a place of peace. It had become a labyrinth, a trap. And somewhere, hidden in the distance, the phantom stream waited, forever elusive, forever close. I didn't know why I was so scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something was hunting me, something I couldn't see, but I could hear. It wasn't just the sound of water anymore. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong. I turned and ran. The woods blurred around me as I sprinted, my legs moving on their own, driven by a primal fear I couldn't explain. The sound of rushing water followed me, just as persistent, just as close. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as though it would burst from the strain. The trees, once so familiar, now felt like looming giants, closing in on me, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for my body. The whispering voice was louder now, clearer. Get out. Get out. I stumbled over uneven ground, my boots catching on roots, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, the phantom stream surged, the sound growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just falling anymore, it was gaining on me. I felt as if I could almost hear the water brushing against the sides of trees, splashing against rocks just behind me. But when I dared to glance over my shoulder, there was nothing but the same endless expanse of trees. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my legs, the sharp pain in my side. The path was becoming less clear, the dense undergrowth of the forest making it harder to move at any pace. The sound of water, however, never faltered. It was constant, as if the stream had become a part of the landscape itself, entwining with the air and the earth, seeping into every part of the forest. Just a trick of the mind, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. It's just the wind. Just the forest. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. The sound wasn't right. There was something unnatural about it, the rhythm, the volume, the way it seemed to match my every step. The whispering came again, this time more urgent. Don't look back. I froze. The voice wasn't just a distant echo. It felt as though it was right next to me, breathing down my neck. My stomach twisted in a knot, and I realized that I hadn't heard any of my surroundings for a while. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, all of it had stopped. Everything was silent except for the stream, the voice, and my own panicked breathing. I had to get out of here. I had to get to the edge of the forest. With a final burst of energy, I forced myself to move faster, pushing through the dense trees. But the moment I thought I might be free, the ground shifted beneath me. My foot caught on something. Before I could react, I was tumbling forward, crashing to the ground. The forest floor was hard and unforgiving, my body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. I gasped, trying to push myself up, but my limbs felt heavy, as though the forest itself was pulling me back. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it, the sound of the stream. Not ahead. Not behind. Directly below me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was so close now that it was almost deafening, a deep gurgling that seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like something alive. I looked down, eyes wide with terror, and there, nestled beneath the underbrush, was a small, dried-up creek. The water wasn't flowing. It wasn't moving at all. But the sound was coming from there. I could feel my pulse thundering in my temples, the fear crawling up my spine like icy fingers. My hands shook as I slowly reached out, brushing away the leaves and debris to reveal the narrow bed of the creek. At first, there was nothing but a few rocks, the cracked earth, and the remnants of old twigs. But then, I saw it. A faint shimmer, almost invisible, rippled across the surface. The water wasn't flowing, but it moved in the way that water does when something stirs beneath it. The sound, the whispering, and the strange energy filled the air. I was no longer alone. Something was here with me. Something I couldn't see but could feel, pressing in from all sides. I had to get up. I had to keep running. But my body refused to obey. The water began to swirl in front of me, rising, churning, as if it was trying to pull me in. I scrambled backward, my hands skimming over the dirt as I tried to push myself away, but the earth felt too soft, too slick. And then I heard it again, the voice, sharp and commanding. Run. I didn't need to be told twice. With every ounce of energy I had left, I sprang to my feet and bolted, not caring which direction I went. The sound of the stream pursued me, growing louder and louder with every step, the whispers now an unrecognizable, maddening cacophony. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs could no longer carry me. And still, the sound followed, closer now, a deafening roar that threatened to swallow me whole. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The trees blurred past me in a wild dance as I pushed through the underbrush. My legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. The stream, no, whatever it was still there, always just behind me, its gurgling turning into something almost human, as though it were calling my name. My heart raced, my breath ragged and shallow. I was running on pure adrenaline now, each step driven by terror, not thought. The whispering voice was louder than ever. It echoed in my ears, twisting and turning, becoming unintelligible, yet somehow I could feel its presence. It was not just the sound of water anymore, it was something far worse, something sentient, malevolent. I had to get away, but the forest felt endless. Each path seemed to loop back on itself, and the trees, thick with the shadows of night, pressed in from all sides. I stumbled over a log, barely catching myself before falling face first into the dirt. A cold, wet sensation spread across my skin, and I realized with horror that the ground was damp. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see the creek again, but there was nothing, just dark earth, just the sound of that infernal stream, still pursuing. My mind spun, trying to rationalize what was happening. This can't be real. It's just the stress of being lost, of being out here too long. The fear. It's playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to convince myself, the worse it got. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be inside my head. I clutched my temples, fighting off the sensation that my very thoughts were being drowned by the roar of the water. I could hear it swirling, crashing, moving beneath the earth itself, as if it were connected to the very ground I was standing on. Stop, just stop. I muttered to myself, trying to steady my breath, but my voice was drowned out by the unnatural current. The water, whatever it was alive. It was moving toward me, and I could feel it drawing closer, like the grip of a hand slipping over my shoulder. My feet moved of their own accord, my body having learned to ignore the pain of exhaustion, the need for rest. I felt like I was being dragged by the sound, pulled forward despite my instincts to turn and flee the other way. But there was no escape. The trees around me began to thin, the shadows shifting as though alive. I could see the moon, pale and sickly through the branches, casting long, haunting shadows on the ground. But even the moon didn't feel safe now. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere had conspired with the entity chasing me. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A clearing. The edge of the forest. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. As I sprinted toward the open space, I heard the unmistakable sound of rushing water. My heart sank. There was no river. No stream. Only the sound. I looked around frantically, eyes wide, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But nothing. Just the endless night and the unbearable noise. I stopped dead in my tracks. The ground was shaking now. My body trembled uncontrollably, and I couldn't stop it. The earth seemed to hum beneath me, vibrating in tune with the sound, and I realized with a growing horror that the water was everywhere. It wasn't just behind me. It wasn't just a sound. It was in the air. The sound of the stream swirled around me, thickening, suffocating, until I couldn't tell if I was hearing the roar of water or feeling it. The earth beneath my feet softened, turning wet and spongy, as though it was being slowly consumed by an invisible flood. The trees were bending, creaking under the weight of the force, their trunks bending toward me as if they were trying to grab hold of me. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring with panic, the cold moisture beginning to seep through my clothes. It wasn't water. It wasn't just the sound. I could feel it now, cold and creeping against my skin, wet but not damp, cold but not freezing. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye, and I turned, nearly collapsing from the weight of fear. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, tall, almost skeletal, shrouded in the mist that had gathered from nowhere. The shape was blurry, indistinct, as though it were both there and not there at all. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic now, as if the figure was somehow controlling the noise. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward, and the ground beneath me shifted. My pulse quickened. And then, with a final, deafening crash, the water broke through. Not from the ground. Not from a stream. It was as though the earth itself had cracked open, and from the darkness, a torrent of water erupted, rushing and swirling like an unstoppable force. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The last thing I saw before everything turned to chaos was the shadowy figure reaching out toward me, its long, bony fingers stretching, and then everything was consumed by the roar of the stream. I didn't even have time to scream. I woke up gasping for air. Cold, sharp breaths that burned my lungs. My eyes shot open, but all I could see was darkness, thick and oppressive. My body was wet, drenched to the core as if I had been pulled from the very stream itself. The sound of water rushing, gurgling, echoing in my ears was relentless. It felt as though the world itself had drowned in it. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy. I felt entangled, as though something was holding me down, constricting my every move. Panic set in immediately as I twisted and fought, my body sinking deeper into the wet earth. But when my hands reached the ground, I realized it wasn't soil I was touching, it was mud, thick and viscous, like the very ground was alive, pulling me back into its depths. Help, somebody, please. The words barely formed, choked out by the weight of the mud, but I could hear my own voice, distant as if it wasn't mine. A hollow echo in the suffocating dark. I pushed harder, struggling against the pull of the earth, but the stream's voice was growing louder, closer, its roar filling my ears with an overwhelming pressure. The longer I fought to free myself, the more it consumed me. It wasn't just the sound of water anymore, it was as if the water itself was breathing, alive and waiting for me to give in. My breath came faster, heart racing. Was I drowning? Was I already dead? No, I had to escape. There had to be a way out. I forced my body up, ignoring the pain shooting through my muscles, clawing at the ground, desperate to get to my feet. But then I stopped. A voice, faint at first, a whisper on the edge of hearing, like the sound of water trickling through rocks, soft and fleeting. Help, help me. It was a voice, no, many voices. They didn't belong to me, but they felt so familiar. I couldn't place them at first. But then, I did. It was the same voice I had heard in the clearing. The voice that had haunted me, drawing me into this nightmare. I froze. It wasn't just a voice. It was a warning. I knew then that the sound of the stream wasn't just an echo. It was a presence, a malevolent force that thrived on fear, feeding off the terror of anyone who dared to wander too close. It had drawn me in, and now it wouldn't let me go. A flash of cold terror surged through my veins. The mud, the water, it was all part of the same thing. The stream wasn't a place, it was a state of being. A space where reality and nightmare blurred into one. The whispers, the shuffling sounds, they were all around me. With newfound resolve, I shoved my hand into the wet earth, trying to leverage myself out of the suffocating mud, but I could feel it pulling me back down. I could hear footsteps. No, not footsteps. The sound of water lapping against something, dragging, pulling. It was moving closer. And then the whispers turned to shrieks. I turned my head in panic, but all I could see were the shadows. The trees loomed like dark, twisted figures, their branches reaching out like hands trying to drag me deeper into the earth. The rush of water drowned out the shrieks, and I felt a deep, primal fear grip me. It was close. Too close. I had to escape. I pushed harder, my arms straining against the mud, but the weight of the earth around me was impossible to fight. My eyes were wide, searching for something, anything, that could help me. And then, through the thick, swirling darkness, I saw it. A faint light, glowing dimly in the distance. The clearing, the place I had come from. No, it couldn't be. I had run from it. I had to keep running, but the light pulled at me, almost like a beacon, calling me back. In a moment of clarity, I realized what was happening. The stream, the voices, they weren't just haunting me. They were dragging me toward the place I had tried to escape. The clearing. The very spot where everything had gone wrong. The light flickered again, and I made my decision. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. With everything I had left, I fought against the mud and the darkness, clawing my way back to the clearing. Each movement felt like an eternity, every inch a battle against the suffocating presence that seemed to wrap itself around me. But the closer I got to the light, the more the air around me seemed to distort. The trees, the ground, they no longer felt real. The whispers were now voices, speaking in fragments, words lost in the chaos of my mind. Then, I reached it. The clearing. But it wasn't the same as before. The light was gone. Instead, there was a figure standing in the center of the clearing, its form tall and thin, draped in shadows. It was still, motionless, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. And then I heard it. A voice, my voice, whispered from the shadows. You shouldn't have come back. I took a step back, heart racing in my chest. But it was already too late. The shadows shifted. The ground trembled beneath me. And the roar of the stream rose to a deafening crescendo. I was no longer running. Now, I was a part of it. The ground beneath me shook violently, as if the very earth itself was waking from a long slumber, and I was its prisoner. My feet sank into the soft, wet soil, and I tried to move, but the air around me thickened, like I was trapped in some unseen web. The figure in the center of the clearing, its silhouette shrouded in darkness, loomed taller, its presence growing stronger with every passing second. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air was too heavy, too thick with the sound of rushing water that wasn't there, at least not in any form I could comprehend. It was as if the earth itself had become a river, swirling with currents that whispered my name. You shouldn't have come back, the voice, my voice, echoed again, sending chills up my spine. It wasn't just my voice, though. It was every lost soul who had ever wandered into these woods. Every echo of fear, regret, and dread that had ever lingered in this place. It was them. The ones who had heard the whispers and had tried to flee, only to be consumed. I stumbled backward, the weight of the presence pressing down on me. The shadows around me thickened, swirling in on themselves like a storm. My heart hammered in my chest, panic clawing at my mind. What was this? What was happening? The figure in the center didn't move. It remained still, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unyielding. I was drawn to it, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The voice, the whispers, they pulled me forward, as if the clearing itself were alive and hungry for me. Help me. I whispered to myself, but the words felt hollow. The clearing was no longer a place of refuge, no longer a place of light. It was alive, and it wanted something from me. It wanted to keep me here. I took a step closer to the figure, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just the voices or the eerie calm that surrounded me. It was a terrible understanding that washed over me, cold and sharp. The stream wasn't just a sound, it was a force. It had been calling me, pulling me, since the moment I had set foot in these woods. Every step I had taken had led me here, to this very moment, and there was no escape. But I wouldn't let it take me. Suddenly, the water sounds grew louder, more intense, like the deep, throaty growl of something monstrous just beneath the surface. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The trees around me creaked, their branches twisting like skeletal hands, reaching out as if to ensnare me. The shadows at the edge of the clearing moved, shifting with a life of their own, and I knew that if I didn't act now, I would be lost forever. I turned away from the figure, my legs trembling beneath me as I ran, as fast as I could, through the thickening fog. My breath came in ragged gasps, the rushing of the invisible stream filling my ears, drowning out every rational thought. I didn't know where I was going anymore. All I knew was that I had to run, had to escape. But no matter how fast I moved, the sounds, the water, the voices, the presence stayed with me, always just a step behind. I could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever, and they weren't just words. They were images, memories. Horrible, fractured memories that weren't mine but seemed to settle into my mind with terrible clarity. I saw faces, pale, twisted faces, of people long lost. They were calling to me, their eyes empty, their mouths stretching in silent screams. I saw the shadows of figures, half submerged in water, reaching out for me, their limbs distorted and wrong. "Don't run," they whispered. "You can't escape." I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head now, filling every inch of my thoughts, pulling at my sanity. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. My legs were burning, my chest tight with the strain of running through the dense underbrush. I had no sense of direction anymore. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, but the sound of the stream, the invisible current, was growing louder. It was closing in on me. Then I stumbled. My foot caught on something sharp, jagged, and I fell hard. The ground beneath me cracked like brittle bones, and I hit the earth with a sickening thud. Pain exploded through my body, but I barely felt it. My heart was thundering in my ears, and the only thing I could think of was the sound of the water, the stream that was now all around me. It was as if the earth itself was a giant river, its currents flowing beneath my very feet. I pushed myself up, scrambling to my feet, but as I did, I saw it. The reflection. It was in the water that wasn't there, in the mist that seemed to curl and writhe like smoke. I saw my own face, pale, bloodshot eyes staring back at me, but there was something wrong. Something horribly, terribly wrong. The reflection grinned at me, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, its eyes empty of humanity. And then I knew. I wasn't running anymore. I had become the stream. The current had taken me. Echoing Cliff in Arizona. Have you ever stood in a place where the world feels too quiet, yet there's something just beyond your perception, something waiting for you to listen? I didn't believe in those things before, those strange, eerie phenomena that others claim to have experienced. But all of that changed the day I found myself on a cliff in the Arizona desert. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, just a hike to clear my head. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain, the vast desert stretching endlessly before me. I had been walking for hours, enjoying the solitude that comes with being out in nature, when I came upon the cliff. The rock face was jagged, ancient, and worn smooth in places by time and weather. It stood alone, towering over the arid landscape, its surface etched with deep cracks and fissures. The view from the top was breathtaking, the vast emptiness of the desert stretching in every direction. There was no sign of life, just endless sand, scrub brush, and the occasional cactus. I felt a strange pull to the place, as if something was calling me. I paused to catch my breath, taking in the scene, when I heard it. At first, It was barely noticeable, a faint murmur, like the sound of the wind passing through a hollow space. But then, it grew louder. The faint hum transformed into a distinct, familiar sound, my own voice. I froze. It wasn't an echo, not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't the usual repetition of sounds bouncing off a rock face. This was different. It was as if my voice, or rather, someone's voice, was coming from the cliff itself. The words were distorted, stretched out with an unnatural delay. At first, it sounded like just an odd reverberation, like hearing your own voice underwater, but then the words began to twist. You shouldn't be here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart skipped a beat. It was my voice, no doubt about it, but it wasn't right. There was something wrong with it, something otherworldly. The words weren't coming from the wind, from the landscape, from the rocks. They felt like they were coming from a place beyond what I could see. I swallowed hard, trying to brush it off. It's just an odd acoustic phenomenon, I told myself. The desert has strange echoes, right? There's no way it's anything else. Still, the hairs on my neck wouldn't lie, and the chill creeping up my spine wouldn't go away. I turned and began walking along the edge of the cliff, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up on me. But then it came again, louder this time. You shouldn't be here. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't just my own now. There was something else in it. Something darker. And it didn't sound like a simple echo anymore. It was as if the very stone beneath my feet had absorbed the words of those who had come before me, and now they were being released. I turned to face the cliff once again, my legs stiff with uncertainty. The sound of my own voice lingered in the air, fading slowly as if struggling to free itself from the rocks. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'm just tired, I muttered to myself. Maybe it's the heat getting to me. But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The echo came again, but this time the words were clearer, more distinct, and the delay felt like an eternity. Leave now, leave now. I felt the air grow cold around me, despite the oppressive desert heat. The sun, which had been relentless, seemed to grow distant, as if the earth itself were pulling away from me. Something was wrong. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew I wasn't welcome here. I couldn't just walk away. Curiosity gripped me, forcing my legs to move toward the cliff edge once more. I didn't want to hear that voice again, but something inside me urged me forward, pushed me closer to the source. And as I neared the rock face, the sound returned, louder and more insistent, like a voice from deep within the earth itself. You are not alone. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The voice was no longer just a sound. It was alive. It wasn't merely repeating my own words, it was echoing something else, something from beyond the living world. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled back a step, feeling a sudden heaviness in the air. Was it just my imagination? Or was something truly other waiting for me at the edge of this cliff? The wind shifted, picking up in intensity as I stood frozen at the edge of the cliff. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Could this be a natural phenomenon, like some strange echo effect caused by the geography? Or was it something else entirely? I took a deep breath and stepped back, my eyes darting around, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. The desert lay still, silent, its emptiness stretching endlessly. Yet, the that voice, it lingered in the air like a phantom, refusing to leave me. The ground beneath my boots felt uncomfortably solid, yet somehow it seemed to shift beneath me. I glanced at the cliff, its jagged face looming overhead like a silent sentinel. The rocks seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, their ancient surfaces wrinkled with the secrets of 1,000 forgotten years. But then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard it again. "Come closer." The voice was so soft, so faint, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. It beckoned me, coaxing me to approach the cliff once more. There was something in the tone that seemed different from the earlier warnings. Now, it felt almost inviting, tempting. I shook my head, refusing to listen. This wasn't right. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. Yet, the pull of the voice was overwhelming. It wasn't just the sound of my own voice now, distorted and delayed. It was other. The tone had changed. It was now layered with a darkness that I couldn't ignore. The sound of water, soft and slow, began to mix in with the whispers. It wasn't the sound of a river or a stream, it was the sound of water dripping from somewhere deep inside the cliff itself. Drip, drip, drip. But it wasn't regular, it came in irregular intervals, as if the very stone was bleeding. I took another step back, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my body refused to obey. What was this place? What kind of madness had taken root here? I could feel the temperature drop as I stood there, the air growing thick and suffocating. The sound seemed to echo around me, stretching and warping until I couldn't tell where the echoes ended and my own thoughts began. Was I hearing things that weren't there? Or was something else speaking through the rocks? Suddenly, a shiver ran down my spine as the voice changed once again. Now, it was no longer just words. It was a laugh. A low, guttural laugh that felt like it came from deep within the earth itself. "We are waiting for you." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The words, those words, weren't just an echo anymore. They weren't just a random distortion of sound. They were alive, aware. And I could feel them all around me, pressing in from every direction, whispering in my ears, scraping against my mind like 1,000 invisible claws. I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. I looked back one final time at the cliff, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely perceptible against the rock. But then it grew clearer, sharper. A figure, no, figures, standing at the base of the cliff. There were dozens of them. I could see them, standing still, their outlines faint but unmistakable. They were staring at me, their forms wavering like smoke. They weren't human. Their shapes flickered, shifting in and out of focus, as though they didn't belong to this world at all. "You are not welcome." The voice was now a chorus, deep and haunting, echoing from the figures themselves. I gasped for air, stumbling backward, my legs finally freeing themselves from the grip of the earth. I turned and ran. The sounds of the voices, the water dripping, the shifting shadows, everything was closing in on me. I could feel their presence surrounding me, their whispers filling the air, urging me to stay, to turn back. But I couldn't. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fled, desperate to escape. Each step seemed to carry me further into the emptiness, but the voices followed. They always followed. I had to get away. I had to leave before it was too late. As I rounded the corner of the cliff, I could hear the echoes of my footsteps, distorted, warped by the strange acoustics. But then, just as I thought I might be free, I heard it again. A whisper, so close it felt like someone was breathing down my neck. It's too late to leave. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The voices were no longer distant. They were right there, behind me. In the distance, I could still hear the faint sound of water, drip, drip, drip. The chilling sensation that something was waiting for me clung to my skin. I could feel them all around me now, pressing in, whispering my name. The world had become distorted, twisted by the force of the cliff's curse. And then, in a single moment, it hit me. I had never been alone on that cliff. The voices, the shadows, they had been with me all along. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, they would follow. Always. You are one of us now. I turned one last time, and in the distance, I saw the cliff. The figures were still there, watching me. And as I looked into the empty desert, I realized with a cold rush of terror, I had joined them. I don't remember how I got back to the town. 1 minute, I was running, my heart hammering in my chest, and the next, I was standing at the edge of the desert, looking back at the distant cliff. I tried to shake off the dread that clung to me like a second skin, but it was useless. The voices still echoed in my ears, their whispers curling around my thoughts. I had told myself it was over, that I had escaped. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The town had never felt so foreign. The hum of the streetlights, the distant chatter of tourists, the rustling of leaves in the wind, all of it seemed distant, muted, as if the world had shifted out of focus. I walked slowly, almost mechanically, towards the small motel where I had checked in. I needed to get some rest, to clear my mind. Maybe, I thought, I just needed to sleep it off. The exhaustion from the heat, the hike, the panic, it had all been too much. But as I entered my room, the air grew thick with an unfamiliar weight. The lights flickered for a brief second, casting strange shadows on the walls. I walked over to the bed, but I couldn't bring myself to lie down. I couldn't stop thinking about the cliff. The figures, the voices, and the feeling that something inside me had changed. That I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. I stepped into the bathroom, splashing water on my face, hoping to shake the sense of dread that had settled over me. But when I looked into the mirror, it wasn't my reflection that stared back. The face in the glass was wrong. For a split second, I thought it was just the lighting, or maybe the exhaustion messing with my vision. But as I blinked, the face in the mirror moved, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't me, it was one of the figures I had seen on the cliff, their features distorted, their eyes hollow and dark, like empty sockets staring into my soul. I gasped and stumbled back, my heart racing. My reflection returned to normal, but the unsettling feeling didn't leave. I could still see the shadow of that face, like a stain burned into my mind. You can't escape us. The voice came from behind me, and I spun around. But the room was empty. No one was there. I was alone. Or was I? I backed up, my hands trembling, my chest tight with panic. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. The walls closed in, the room growing smaller, suffocating. The sound of water, drip, 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 was all around me. It wasn't the sound of the bathroom faucet. No, this was different. It was like the water was coming from within the walls, seeping through the cracks, dripping from the ceiling. And then I heard it again, the voice, soft but chilling. Come closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the room, but my feet were frozen to the floor. The voice seemed to be pulling me in, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. The door behind me was so close, yet it felt as though it was miles away. I turned, desperate to escape, and as I reached for the door handle, I caught a glimpse of the mirror once more. The figure was there, in the reflection. I tried to look away, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure in the mirror slowly reached out, its hand stretching toward me, its fingers elongating unnaturally. And then it spoke again. "You are one of us now." I screamed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I couldn't take it any longer. I tore open the door and bolted out into the night, the cold air slapping my face. But it was no use. The sound of water was there, too, as if it followed me. The whispers, the soft drip drip drip, they were in my ears now, so close, as if I were standing right next to the source. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone. But there was no one. No one except for me. Except for the faint flickering shadow on the edge of my vision. The town felt alive with a strange presence. It was like I was walking in a dream, but the dream was no longer mine. The voices whispered, and I realized that no matter where I went, the figures would always be with me. The cliff was no longer just a place, it was a part of me. The echoes of those voices were now inside my mind, replaying over and over again. The air seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't understand. I couldn't escape. The voices, the shadows, the feeling, it was all consuming. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I ever could escape. You were ours. I collapsed to my knees in the middle of the deserted street, the night stretching on forever around me. I looked up at the stars, but they, too, seemed to shimmer with a malevolent energy. The weight of the presence pressing down on me was unbearable, like invisible hands pulling me under. And then, just as I thought I might lose consciousness, I heard one final whisper, soft and chilling. "Welcome home." The darkness closed in, and I knew, without a doubt, that I was never leaving this place. I awoke the next morning, or what I thought was morning. The first rays of sunlight barely filtered through the drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with a stillness that felt unnatural. Everything seemed off, like I had stepped into a world that was almost real but not quite. The echoes had stopped, for now, but I knew they weren't gone. They were always just beneath the surface, ready to return the moment I let my guard down. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, monitored. As if the entire town, the land itself, was waiting for me to make my next move. I didn't know what to do next. Should I leave? Should I find some way to escape the hold this place had on me? Or should I stay and try to understand what was happening? But no matter where I turned, I was always drawn back to the cliff. To the voices. To the faces that haunted me from the mirror. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. You were one of us now. Was I? Was that what this was? A slow transformation into something other, something trapped between worlds? I decided to go back to the cliff. If the voices were going to haunt me, then at least I could confront them. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I could finally rid myself of whatever it was that had attached itself to me. The town felt like it was watching me as I left the motel. It was a small, dusty place, but now, with my mind clouded by fear and confusion, it seemed to stretch on forever. The dry desert air burned my lungs, and the sun was harsh against my skin. Every step felt heavy, like the ground was pulling at me, reluctant to let me leave. When I reached the cliff, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though I had been here before, even though I knew I hadn't. The voices were gone for now, but the presence lingered, thick in the air. It felt like the earth itself was waiting. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the vast emptiness, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Then, the wind picked up. It wasn't a gust, but a steady, unsettling breeze that seemed to carry with it a sound I couldn't place. It was a soft, rhythmic hum, like the slow flow of water, but it wasn't water. I could feel it, the way it vibrated through the earth, through my body. The hum was the same as the one I had heard before, back in the motel room when I thought I was losing my mind. But it was louder now, closer. And then I heard it. The voices, faint at first, then louder, repeating the same words over and over again. Come closer. I froze. My heart stopped. My hands trembled as I looked around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The cliff was still empty, the landscape still barren, but the voices, they were everywhere. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the earth itself had tethered me to this spot, keeping me in place, forcing me to listen. I was drawn to the edge of the cliff, the sound of water growing louder with every passing second until it became deafening, like a river crashing against rocks. But there was no river. There was nothing. And then the voices stopped. Silence. A deep, suffocating silence that swallowed everything whole. And that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of my vision, but when I turned, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, my reflection. I reached for it. No, I didn't want to, but my body moved on its own. My hand reached out, and as it did, the reflection mirrored my every movement. It smiled. I couldn't stop it. The figure, wearing my face, grinned at me, its eyes empty and black, its skin pale, almost sickly. Its hand reached toward me, stretching unnaturally long until its fingers brushed mine. A cold shock shot through my body, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. The cliff was no longer solid, it was alive. Suddenly, I was falling. I don't remember what happened next. There was only darkness. Cold, endless darkness. The wind rushed past my ears as I plummeted, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of the water rushing, crashing, pulling me deeper into its depths. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, I was still. I opened my eyes. I wasn't falling anymore. I was lying on the ground, back at the base of the cliff, but everything had changed. The landscape around me was distorted, twisted, like the world had been warped, reshaped by something beyond my understanding. The sky was darker now, the sun a distant, muted ball of light. The voices whispered again. Only this time, they were clearer, sharper. Welcome home. And then I understood. There was no escaping. There never had been. The cliff, the voices, they weren't just a place. They were a part of me now, a part of this world, and I was no longer who I had been before. I had crossed a threshold, one that had no return. This place, this thing, had claimed me. And now, I would never leave. I stood, knowing that I would never be free. That I was now a part of the echoes that called to the living from beyond the veil. The wind whispered, and I couldn't tell if it was the land speaking or if it was me. The wind howled through the empty desert night. It was a hollow sound, empty and yet full of whispers. They danced with the gusts, weaving through the air, filling the silence with an eerie hum that seemed to come from all directions. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my legs heavy as if bound by unseen chains. The echoes, my echoes, filled the air around me, bouncing off the cliffs, reverberating with strange intent. Each one of my footsteps seemed to trigger a new set of voices, like ripples in a dark, forgotten pond. I tried to move, but every part of me felt sluggish, trapped in a strange, unearthly fog. "Welcome home," they whispered again, this time closer. Almost like a soft, dry-out breath in my ear. I wanted to scream, to shout, to break free from whatever force held me in place. But my voice, when it came, was not mine. It was distorted, layered with other voices, some faint, some forceful, and all with a hollow, metallic ring. It was my voice, but it was them speaking through me. I stumbled back, a sharp pain shooting through my chest. This isn't real, I thought, forcing myself to believe it. This can't be happening. But the air felt thick, too thick, and the ground beneath my feet was no longer solid. It shifted with every step I took, as though it was alive, responding to my movements. I could hear the distant hum of water now, still the same sound, but it was no longer distant. It was closer, and it was no longer natural. It was a rhythm, a beat, like a pulse, something dark and ancient, something that lived beneath the earth itself. I looked around, my mind racing, trying to find a way out. The landscape had changed, twisted, almost as if the land itself had been carved into something unrecognizable, shaped by the voices I had heard. The horizon was a blur, as if the world had no end. I could still hear them, the voices, coming from all directions. "Join us," they beckoned. "You are one of us now." I turned in a panic, desperate to find something, anything, that made sense. My vision blurred, and when it cleared, I found myself standing at the edge of the cliff once more. The wind carried the same whispering hum, louder now, the voices merging into a chorus of unsettling echoes. I backed away, shaking, but there was nowhere to go. I felt the weight of their presence all around me. They were here. They had always been here. And now, I could not escape them. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled. A low rumble, like the earth itself, was waking up. I fell to my knees as the vibration shot through my body, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. The very air felt different, charged, electric. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A shadow. It moved against the fading light of the sky, stretching, reaching, until it took form. A figure. Tall. Unnatural. Its shape was fluid, its features obscured by the mist that surrounded it. And I knew, in the pit of my stomach, that this was the source of the voices. The thing that had been calling me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure reached out with long, thin fingers, its presence overwhelming, its form bending in ways that defied logic. It loomed over me, and its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were voids, empty and endless, reflecting nothing but the abyss. "You are one of us now," it whispered, its voice an amalgamation of my own and the many others that had come before me. I screamed, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of its gaze. It was as if every part of me, every thought, every memory, was being erased, replaced by an endless echo. I reached out, but my hand was no longer my own. It was a part of them, part of the voices. And then, as the figure's hand drew closer, the ground beneath me split open. A chasm yawned wide, a black void that threatened to swallow me whole. The last thing I saw was the figure's empty gaze, staring into me, into my soul. And I fell. I fell into the darkness, the abyss opening to welcome me as the last echoes of my own voice faded into the distance. And then everything went silent. Somewhere far off, a whisper stirred in the wind. Another soul to join the echoes. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.